Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're stepping behind the Hollywood curtain and into the part of the story Martin Scorsese never showed you. You've seen the helicopter. You've seen the paranoia. You've seen Henry Hill spiraling into chaos before that dramatic drug bust. But what if that's not how it really happened? What if Henry wasn't caught in a moment of cocaine-fueled panic, but after months of surveillance, undercover buys, and a carefully constructed narcotics case that stretched far beyond New York, all the way to Pittsburgh? And what if his decision to flip wasn't sudden fear, but cold survival math? Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? It's always fascinating to see this quiet little underworld growing across countries, across time zones, across midnight hours. And if you enjoy deep, slow-burn Mafia stories that separate myth from reality, consider subscribing. Join us here in the shadows, where we don't just repeat the legend, we dissect it. Now, take a slow breath. Let the noise of the day drift away. Imagine Nassau County detectives watching from parked cars, phone lines tapped, associates already talking, and Henry Hill, believing he still had control. This is the story of how the mob's golden boy was really caught. Why Paul Vario cut him loose. Why Jimmy Burke may have been planning something darker. And the exact moment Henry realized the only way to survive was to betray everything. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. The real Henry Hill after Lufthansa. The money was still warm. It smelled like jet fuel and cold December air and greed. Bags stacked in basements. Cash wrapped in rubber bands. Millions of dollars taken in less than an hour from the Lufthansa cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport. The biggest robbery in American history at that time. It should have been the moment everything felt invincible. Instead, it was the moment everything began to rot. In the weeks after the robbery in December of 1978, something shifted in the air around Jimmy Burke. He didn't celebrate. He didn't relax. He watched. He listened. He began to see threats everywhere, like cracks forming in a frozen lake. Men who had helped pull off the job started disappearing. A truck driver found dead in a van. A bartender shot in the back of the head. A partner who talked too much suddenly gone. The message wasn't subtle. Loose ends were liabilities. And liabilities got erased. Henry Hill saw it happening up close. The movie makes it look frantic. Helicopters overhead. Paranoia born from cocaine and insomnia. But the real fear began long before the helicopters. It started in quiet rooms, in half-finished conversations, in the way Jimmy's eyes lingered just a second too long on someone's face. Henry had always admired Jimmy. The man was bold, charismatic, ruthless when he needed to be. But after Lufthansa, Jimmy became something else. He wasn't just cautious. He was calculating in a colder way, like a chess player removing pieces from the board before the game even began. Henry understood the rules. He had grown up around them. Loyalty was oxygen. Silence was survival. But he also understood something else. Jimmy trusted no one anymore. Not even the men who had made him rich. And that realization pressed on Henry's chest like a weight. Because Henry wasn't just a loyal soldier. He had secrets. While the Lufthansa money circulated through hidden channels and cash bundles were quietly laundered through businesses and loans, Henry was building something separate. Something dangerous. Something forbidden. Cocaine. Paul Vario had made his position crystal clear. No drugs. No heroin. No cocaine. The heat from narcotics cases was like standing under a spotlight in a dark theater. You might think you're invisible until the light flips on and every eye turns toward you. Paul understood that narcotics investigations came with long sentences and federal attention. Gambling was one thing. Hijacking was manageable. But drugs? Drugs invited wiretaps. Informants. Federal prosecutors who never let go. Henry knew all of this. He did it anyway. It didn't start massive. It rarely does. At first, it was ounces. A connection here. A buyer there. Cash that moved quickly and cleanly. Cocaine in the late 1970s wasn't just a drug. It was status. It flowed through nightclubs and construction sites and suburban kitchens. It made people feel invincible, and it made dealers feel powerful. Henry had always been drawn to that feeling. He liked moving between worlds. The wise guys in Queens, the suburban buyers who thought they were untouchable, the suppliers from Pittsburgh who could deliver weight without asking too many questions. It felt like building a second engine under the hood of a car that was already running. But two engines create heat, and heat attracts attention. By late 1978, Henry wasn't dabbling. He was coordinating shipments that moved in pounds, not grams. Cocaine and quaaludes flowing weekly. Money stacking in shoeboxes and envelopes. His wife involved. Associates handling pickups and deliveries. It was structured, repeated, organized. This wasn't a reckless addict making bad decisions. It was a man running a serious narcotics operation under the nose of a crew that would never forgive him if they knew. And all the while, Jimmy was cleaning house. Each time another Lufthansa participant turned up dead, Henry felt the walls narrow. He tried not to show it. He joked. He kept moving. But inside, a quiet arithmetic was forming. If Jimmy could kill men over suspicion, what would he do if he found out about drugs? The irony is that Henry didn't see himself as reckless. He saw himself as evolving, diversifying, building independence. Gambling and hijacking were volatile streams of income. Cocaine was steady. Repeat customers. Predictable demand. High margins. It was business. But in the Mafia, business isn't just about profit. It's about permission. And Henry had none. Paul Vario was old school. He believed in hierarchy the way priests believe in scripture. Orders weren't suggestions. They were survival guidelines. When Paul said no drugs, it wasn't about morality. It was about insulation. Keep the family safe. Keep the heat manageable. Don't invite federal attention into your house. Henry understood the reasoning. He just believed he could outrun it. He believed he could operate in shadows that were dark enough. But shadows shift. As 1979 began, Henry's life split into compartments. With Jimmy, he was the trusted associate. Calm, loyal, watching the fallout from Lufthansa like everyone else. With Paul, he was the dependable earner. No drama, no waves. And then there was the other side. The phone calls made in low voices. The drives out of state. The exchanges in parking lots where engines stayed running. The packages tucked under seats like secrets. Cocaine has a way of accelerating everything. Thoughts, conversations, suspicion. Henry was using heavily now. The lines blurred between user and distributor. Nights stretched longer. Paranoia crept in like dampness through walls. And Jimmy noticed everything. Not specifics. Not proof. Just energy. There were moments when Henry would sit across from Jimmy in a diner booth, coffee steaming between them, and feel studied. Measured. Like a piece on that chessboard. Jimmy didn't accuse. He didn't need to. His silence was louder. Henry reassured himself. The drug operation was separate. It didn't touch Jimmy's money. It didn't interfere with crew business. It was controlled, contained. But control is an illusion when fear is in the room. The more Jimmy eliminated potential risks tied to Lufthansa, the more Henry understood how fragile loyalty could become under pressure. A man could be your partner on Monday and a headline by Friday. And the headlines weren't stopping. Federal investigators were circling the Lufthansa case. The largest cash robbery in American history wasn't going to fade quietly. The attention lingered like smoke after a fire. Henry had two storms forming above him. One from the inside, one from the outside, and he was standing directly between them. The movie shows chaos. A man unraveling in one frantic day. But the real story was slower, tighter, like a rope being pulled incrementally until you barely notice the constriction. Henry wasn't caught off guard by life. He was building something dangerous while pretending everything was fine. He still believed he could balance it. He believed he could be the bridge between old-school mob rules and new-school profit streams. That he could satisfy Jimmy's expectations and outrun Paul's prohibition. That he could move pounds of cocaine through suburban homes without the family ever finding out. He believed he was smarter than the structure around him. But the structure had survived for decades because it crushed smart men who overreached. By the end of 1979, the disappearances connected to Lufthansa had slowed. Most loose ends had been tied. The crew appeared stable again. On the surface. Underneath, Henry's second life was growing. More buyers. Larger quantities. Regular routes. The operation was no longer a side hustle. It was an enterprise. And enterprises leave footprints. Henry didn't yet know that narcotics detectives were beginning to watch him. That patterns were being noticed. That conversations were being overheard by people who weren't part of the crew. He didn't yet know that the heat Paul had feared was slowly being drawn toward him. For now, he only felt the internal pressure. Jimmy's cold calculation. Paul's strict boundaries. The tension of carrying a secret that could get him killed from either direction. He kept smiling. Kept dealing. Kept convincing himself that the danger was manageable. But danger doesn't announce itself with sirens. It waits. And somewhere, not far from where Henry felt most secure, men with badges were beginning to connect dots he didn't even realize he had left behind. The robbery that should have made him untouchable had instead placed him on a narrowing path. And he was walking it willingly, unaware that the real threat wasn't the helicopters he would one day fear in the sky. It was the silence building quietly beneath his feet. Chapter 2. The Pittsburgh Pipeline. The calls always came late at night. Not because it looked dramatic. Not because someone wanted to feel like a character in a crime movie. But because late at night, the world softens. The streets quiet down. The neighbors stop listening. And men who are building something illegal prefer silence as their partner. Henry Hill would sit at his kitchen table in Long Island, cigarette burning low between his fingers, the house dark except for the yellow glow over the stove. The Lufthansa money had already changed everything. But this was something different. This wasn't a one-time score. This was a system. On the other end of the line, voices from Pittsburgh. Suppliers who didn't care about New York politics. Men who saw numbers, not names. They didn't bow to Paul Vario. They didn't answer to Jimmy Burke. They cared about weight, quality, and cash. And Henry was becoming their New York bridge. The movie makes it look like chaos. Like Henry was running around frantically, scrambling between buyers, high on his own supply, unraveling in fast motion. But the truth is colder. Henry wasn't unraveling. He was building. By early 1979, the cocaine business wasn't a side hustle. It was an organized distribution network that ran weekly like clockwork. Shipments moved from Pennsylvania into New York with quiet precision. Couriers used normal cars, normal clothes, normal routines. Nothing flashy, nothing cinematic. Cocaine doesn't move like a bank robbery. It moves like water through pipes. Quiet, steady, always flowing. Henry had tapped into a pipeline that delivered multiple ounces at a time, and often more. Pounds moved through his hands in rotation. Some weeks lighter, some weeks heavier, but consistent. Consistency is what makes something dangerous. He wasn't the street-level dealer standing outside a club. He was coordinating supply, storage, and redistribution. He had buyers in Queens, in Long Island, in suburban homes where the curtains stayed drawn and the lawns were freshly trimmed. Construction workers, club owners, small-time distributors who answered only to him. And the money came faster than anything hijacking had ever delivered. Hijackings were bursts of adrenaline and risk. Gambling was steady but capped by territory. Cocaine was exponential. Every ounce cut, every sale multiplied. The margins were intoxicating. Henry had always liked feeling important, needed, central. The drug business amplified that feeling. Phones rang constantly. People depended on him. He controlled who got product and who didn't. Power wrapped itself around him like a tailored suit. But power without protection is exposure. Paul Vario had forbidden drugs with a simple clarity. No heroin, no cocaine, not in his crew, not under his umbrella. The federal sentences were too long. The investigations too deep. The risk too radioactive. To Paul, narcotics were like inviting a spotlight into a dark room. Henry told himself he could keep it separate. He rationalized it the way ambitious men do. It's not touching Paul's money. It's not affecting crew business. It's independent, self-contained. But in the Mafia, independence is an illusion. Every dollar earned outside the hierarchy is a quiet act of rebellion. And Henry was earning a lot of dollars. His wife, Karen wasn't just watching from the sidelines. She was inside it. She handled packages, stored product, delivered cash. She knew what was in the house. She knew the stakes. At first, it felt like a partnership, a shared secret that bonded them tighter. There's something seductive about building an empire together. The thrill of risk can feel like romance when the money is flowing and the future seems wide open. But secrets age quickly. The cocaine was stored in small quantities at first, hidden in drawers, tucked inside containers that look harmless. But as the pipeline strengthened, storage became a logistical puzzle. More product meant more hiding places, more movement, more risk. Henry recruited help. Bobby Germain, Robin Cooperman, associates who weren't made men, not bound by the old-school codes the way Jimmy and Paul were. They were younger, looser, less ideological. They cared about profit, and profit was everywhere. Shipments came in from Pittsburgh almost like subscription boxes. Predictable intervals, quality that buyers trusted. Once customers trust the product, they return. Once they return, they bring friends. Once friends come, the network grows. It wasn't random dealing. It was structured distribution. Henry had drivers, runners, people who handled pickups and deliveries. He kept mental ledgers of who owed what, who was reliable, who was slipping. He operated like a small corporation without paperwork. And cocaine has a way of expanding ambition. The more he moved, the more he saw the possibility of scaling it. More buyers, larger quantities, tighter routes. He began to think beyond survival. He thought about wealth that wasn't tied to the unpredictable moods of Jimmy Burke. Lufthansa had made everyone rich, but Lufthansa had also made everyone paranoid. Jimmy's instability after the robbery was no secret. Men were disappearing. People who talked too much or spent too freely or looked nervous found themselves erased. Henry watched that happen and came to a dangerous conclusion. He needed something of his own. The Pittsburgh pipeline gave him that. But the more independent he became, the more vulnerable he was if discovered. There were nights when he would sit alone and imagine what would happen if Paul found out. He could almost hear the conversation. Calm, controlled, disappointed, no shouting, just consequences. And consequences in that world didn't come with warnings. Yet he kept going, because cocaine wasn't just money. It was control. In gambling, you depend on chance. In hijacking, you depend on opportunity. In narcotics, once you secure supply and customers, you create momentum. Momentum is addictive. Henry began using more heavily, not because he was out of control, not yet, but because access was constant. Lines before meetings, lines before drives, lines to stay sharp, to stay awake. Cocaine whispers that you're sharper than you are. It magnifies confidence and muffles caution. The late 1970s were saturated with it. Nightclubs pulsed with it. Construction sites hummed with it. Suburban kitchens hid it in sugar bowls. And Henry was at the center of that hum. But networks create patterns. And patterns leave trails. Each weekly trip to Pennsylvania was a thread. Each delivery route a repetition. Each associate another potential weak point. He believed compartmentalization would protect him. Keep Jimmy separate. Keep Paul ignorant. Keep the crew clean. But the more moving parts a machine has, the more chances it has to break. There are subtle signs. Buyers getting nervous. Associates talking more than they should. Increased caution in conversations. Henry ignored the signs the way men ignore the first tremors of an earthquake. If the ground hasn't split open yet, it must be fine. Meanwhile, the old world and the new world were colliding inside him. Jimmy represented the old way. Loyalty enforced by fear. Money made through hijackings and unions. Territory and hierarchy. The Pittsburgh pipeline represented the new way. Interstate supply chains. Suburban demand. Faster money. Federal-level risk. Henry was straddling both. And straddling two systems means you answer to two dangers. Jimmy was still unpredictable. Still cleaning up loose ends from Lufthansa. Still measuring loyalty in silence. If he sensed Henry's independence, it could be fatal. But another danger was forming, quieter, colder. Narcotics detectives don't move like mobsters. They move like accountants. They log patterns. They track vehicles. They watch houses at odd hours. They record license plates. They wait. Henry didn't yet know he was being watched. He only knew that the drug business was now too big to casually stop. Stopping would mean disappointing suppliers, losing credibility with buyers, walking away from money that had already reshaped his lifestyle. Money changes expectations quickly. The house got bigger, the spending looser, the sense of entitlement deeper. And when spending grows faster than legitimate income, questions eventually follow. But in early 1979, Henry felt insulated. He believed that because the pipeline ran through Pittsburgh, because it wasn't strictly local, it was safer, less visible, spread out. He believed that careful driving and quiet exchanges were enough. He believed that if he kept the crew out of it, if he didn't involve Paul or Jimmy, he was protecting them. But secrecy doesn't erase risk. It multiplies it. The drug business is like building a skyscraper on sand. At first, the structure rises quickly. It looks impressive, strong, profitable. But beneath it, the foundation shifts. Henry's foundation was secrecy, and secrecy isolates. The more he earned from cocaine, the less dependent he became on the traditional crew. The less dependent he became, the more distance grew. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally. He was no longer just an associate. He was an operator with his own revenue stream. And operators who don't report earnings are liabilities. By late 1979, the Pittsburgh pipeline was fully operational. Weekly movement, established buyers, trusted couriers. Henry had achieved what he thought was balance. Jimmy still trusted him. Paul still believed he was clean. The money kept flowing. But balance in the underworld is like walking a tightrope during a storm. It feels stable until one gust shifts the rope beneath your feet. Somewhere in Nassau County, men with badges were beginning to notice something small. A car seen repeatedly at odd hours. A house with unusual traffic. A familiar face connected to whispers of cocaine. Nothing dramatic, just curiosity. And curiosity, when paired with patience, becomes investigation. Henry had built the pipeline carefully. He just hadn't noticed that someone else had begun mapping it. And pipelines, once mapped, don't just carry product. They carry evidence. He believed he was running ahead of danger. He didn't realize danger was quietly walking behind him, measuring each step. And the more the Pittsburgh pipeline strengthened, the closer it brought him to the kind of attention Paul Vario had always feared. The spotlight wasn't on yet, but someone's finger was hovering over the switch. And when it flipped, the money from Lufthansa would no longer matter. Because the real storm wouldn't come from inside the Mafia. It would come from outside it. And Henry was about to learn that federal heat doesn't fade the way street tension does. It burns until something gives. Chapter 3. Karen's direct role. The knock on the door always sounded ordinary. That was the point. A neighbor could be dropping by, a friend stopping in, a babysitter arriving early. The house in Long Island didn't look like the headquarters of a narcotics pipeline. It looked like a suburban dream wrapped in vinyl siding and trimmed hedges. A place where children rode bikes in circles and husbands left for work with briefcases. But sometimes, when the door opened, what crossed the threshold wasn't a casserole. It was cocaine. The movie shows her as volatile, emotional, occasionally aware of the chaos, but not fully inside it. A wife reacting to her husband's spiral. The truth was quieter and far more complicated. She knew. Not everything at first. Not the full weight of pounds moving through state lines. Not the invisible federal risk creeping closer. But she knew enough to understand that what they were building wasn't just business. It was exposure. In the beginning, she justified it the same way Henry did. Everyone was making money. Everyone was using. It was the late 1970s. Cocaine was practically fashionable. Not heroin in alleyways. Not something dark and tragic. It was champagne powder. It moved through cocktail parties and construction offices with the same casual acceptance as expensive wine. She saw the cash. She saw the buyers. She saw the energy. And she saw the ambition in her husband's eyes. That ambition was hard to resist. Money had always flowed in their marriage, but now it was flowing differently. Faster, thicker, more consistent. Envelopes filled and refilled. Cash tucked into drawers, into closets, into spaces that once held nothing but winter coats. It didn't feel like desperation. It felt like momentum. She wasn't a passive observer. She handled packages when Henry wasn't home. She stored product in places only she controlled. She made calls, confirmed times, arranged pickups. At first, it was subtle. A favor here, a delivery there. But favors become responsibilities quickly. When shipments arrived from Pittsburgh, someone had to receive them. Someone had to hold them until redistribution. Someone had to smooth over minor problems with buyers who were impatient or paranoid. And sometimes that someone was her. There is a specific kind of fear that comes with holding something illegal in your hands while your children sleep upstairs. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It hums in the background. A low, persistent vibration. She felt it, but she also felt loyalty. Marriage in that world wasn't just romance. It was alliance. When your husband builds something risky, stepping back isn't neutral. It can feel like betrayal. So she stepped forward. She rationalized it carefully. They weren't hurting anyone directly. Buyers wanted it. The money provided security. The kids would have better schools, better clothes, a future that didn't look like struggle. But rationalization is like wallpaper over cracks. The structure underneath still shifts. Henry trusted her because she was disciplined. She didn't talk loosely. She didn't panic under pressure. When couriers arrived late, she stayed composed. When buyers showed impatience, she kept her voice steady. She became a quiet extension of the operation. The movie shows her throwing guns into toilets and screaming in fear when law enforcement approaches. But long before panic entered the picture, there was competence. She knew which buyers were safe and which were volatile. She understood that certain packages required faster movement. She memorized routines, delivery days, storage spots. She could switch hiding places on instinct. Their house wasn't just a home. It was a node in a distribution network. And every node increases risk. The drug trade doesn't operate on chaos alone. It thrives on predictability. Weekly shipments, regular clients, reliable intermediaries. When predictability sets in, complacency often follows. There were nights when Henry would return from meetings, high-strung but confident, and lay out the week's plan at the kitchen table. How much had arrived? Where would go? Who needed to be paid? She listened. Sometimes she asked questions. Sometimes she pushed back gently. Are you sure about him? He seems nervous. Or, that route feels exposed. She wasn't just storing cocaine. She was thinking about logistics. And thinking about logistics means you're invested. The weight of that investment began to creep into her sleep. Small sounds outside the house would wake her. Headlights lingering too long on the street felt ominous. A car parked across the road for more than a few minutes created a tightness in her chest. But in daylight, when buyers came and money exchanged hands smoothly, the fear softened again. The suburban illusion was powerful. Neighbors waved. Kids played. Lawns were mowed. No one suspected that inside one of those tidy homes, ounces and pounds were being measured and redistributed like inventory in a warehouse. Cocaine doesn't announce itself with sirens. It hides in sugar bowls. But every secret share between husband and wife carries weight. There were moments when she questioned the direction, when news reports mentioned arrests in other counties, when she heard whispers about federal sentences that stretched longer than childhood itself. She would look at Henry and search his face. He always projected control. That projection was part of his power. He explained the risks like manageable variables. We're careful. It's separate from the crew. Nobody knows. It's just business. Business. That word is slippery. It makes danger sound organized, rational. She wanted to believe him. And belief is powerful in marriage. Yet she also understood something Henry tried not to say out loud. If Paul Vario discovered this operation, the consequences wouldn't come from police first. They would come from within. Old-school mob bosses didn't debate narcotics violations. They corrected them. And correction in that world could mean anything. Still, the money kept flowing. With money came comfort, jewelry, renovations, cash cushions that made daily life easier. It's difficult to walk away from a machine that produces comfort so efficiently. She began to see herself not just as Henry's wife, but as a partner in survival. If he was going to run this pipeline, she would help him do it correctly, cleanly, carefully. But careful is a relative term. The more product moved through the house, the more exposure expanded. Friends and acquaintances began to suspect something was different. Not necessarily drugs, but growth. Sudden spending. Energy. People notice shifts. And sometimes, people talk. Her direct involvement deepened gradually. She handled cash counting. Insured debts were collected. Watched for buyers who lingered too long. She became attuned to tone shifts in conversations. The slight tremble in someone's voice that signaled nerves. Because nerves create risk. The pipeline was growing. More buyers. Larger weekly shipments. More coordination between Pittsburgh suppliers and New York distribution. And the house became central. Centrality is dangerous. The more indispensable a location becomes, the more devastating its compromise would be. She understood that instinctively. There were evenings when she would stand in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, listening to the hum of appliances and the distant sound of traffic, and feel a sense of unreality. As if they were actors in a play only they knew was happening. The children would laugh upstairs. The world outside remained calm. And inside cabinets, products sat waiting to be moved. There's a particular kind of tension in living two lives under one roof. One life measured by PDA meetings and grocery lists. The other measured by ounces and cash bundles. The tension doesn't explode immediately. It accumulates. She began noticing Henry using more heavily. Not dramatically. Not in a way that screamed collapse. But enough that edges blurred. Conversations repeated. Focus drifted. Cocaine sharpens and dulls at the same time. She worried quietly. But worry is hard to articulate when you are also complicit. Her role meant she couldn't stand outside the operation and critique it. She was inside it. And inside, loyalty feels heavier than fear. There were moments when she imagined walking away. Stopping. Insisting that the pipeline shut down before it grew further. But shutting down a drug network isn't like canceling a subscription. Suppliers expect orders. Buyers expect product. Associates expect payment. Walking away creates enemies. And enemies in both the mob and narcotics world are not theoretical. So she stayed committed. Committed to careful storage. To disciplined silence. To being the steady presence that made the house function smoothly despite the invisible risk. What neither she nor Henry fully grasped was that while they were managing the internal risk of mob discovery, another set of eyes was beginning to watch. Patterns form in neighborhoods. Cars seen repeatedly. Visitors at unusual hours. Brief exchanges that look insignificant individually, but meaningful collectively. Narcotics detectives build cases like puzzle solvers. They don't need drama. They need repetition. And repetition was exactly what the house was generating. She didn't know that license plates were being noted, that faces were being recognized, that curiosity had quietly shifted toward investigation. She only knew that each week the pipeline ran, and she was part of it, part of the storage, part of the logistics, part of the concealment. When people later framed her as a frightened wife caught in chaos, it simplified the truth. She wasn't merely reacting. She was participating. Participation doesn't make someone heartless. It makes them human, motivated by loyalty, seduced by stability, convinced they can manage risk better than others have. But risk doesn't negotiate. It accumulates interest. The more central the house became, the more catastrophic its exposure would be. And somewhere beyond the trimmed lawns and quiet streets, investigators were beginning to sense that something in that suburban home wasn't as ordinary as it appeared. The knock on the door still sounded normal. But normal was thinning. And when normal finally cracked, it wouldn't just expose Henry. It would expose her. And the house that felt like a fortress would suddenly feel like glass. The pipeline was strong. The partnership was committed. The money was steady. But the silence protecting them was beginning to weaken. And once silence breaks, it never returns the same. Chapter 4, Nassau County Narcotics begins watching. The first time they saw him, it didn't feel like destiny. It felt like curiosity. A car idling too long outside a quiet Long Island house. A familiar face connected loosely to rumors. Traffic patterns that didn't quite match the rhythm of suburban life. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just a detail that didn't sit right. Investigations don't begin with sirens. They begin with discomfort. In early 1979, Nassau County narcotics detectives weren't hunting Henry Hill specifically. They were hunting patterns, small-time distributors, supply routes, the kind of mid-level operations that feed a county quietly without making headlines. In Henry's world, it started to create patterns. Neighbors had noticed vehicles arriving late at night. Not every night. Not enough to cause alarm, but enough to whisper about. Men stepping out briefly, returning with small packages. Engines running longer than necessary. In isolation, it meant nothing. In repetition, it meant something. One detective wrote down a plate number on a legal pad, almost absent-mindedly. He had seen the same car earlier that week parked near another suspected dealer's home. Coincidence was possible, but narcotics detectives are trained to distrust coincidence. Henry, meanwhile, believed he was invisible. He rotated vehicles when possible, kept exchanges brief, avoided flashy behavior. He had learned from the old-school mob men that subtlety was survival. If you don't draw attention, attention rarely finds you. But drugs draw attention in ways hijackings do not. Hijackings are sudden, loud, singular. Drugs are ongoing, transactional, constant. Constant creates footprints. The Pittsburgh pipeline required weekly movement. Couriers driving back and forth. Buyers cycling in predictable windows. Money flowing in envelopes that moved through banks and hands. And somewhere along that chain, a small dealer got picked up on an unrelated charge. He wasn't high level, not someone Henry considered significant, just a man who bought ounces regularly and redistributed smaller amounts to his own circle. When detectives questioned him, they didn't get much at first. Most small dealers aren't eager to talk. Pride mixes with fear. Silence feels like loyalty. But pressure changes posture. The dealer mentioned a name casually, not in confession, in irritation. Someone up the chain. A supplier who moved weight quietly. A guy who seemed untouchable. Henry Hill. The name wasn't new to law enforcement. It had floated in other contexts. Hijackings. Associations. But drugs were different territory. The detective wrote it down. Curiosity sharpened. Surveillance began lightly. Unmarked cars parked intermittently. Observations logged in notebooks. Dates. Times. Visitors. Duration of visits. At first, the logs were thin. A few cars. A few short stays. Nothing definitive. But over weeks, the entries thickened. Same vehicles returning. Same short patterns. Visitors entering empty-handed and leaving with subtle bulges under jackets. Exchanges so smooth they could almost be mistaken for neighborly favors. Almost. Detectives began to notice Henry's driving habits. The routes he preferred. The way he circled blocks before parking. The subtle caution of someone who believed he was being careful. Careful doesn't mean invisible. Careful means predictable. And predictability is what surveillance feeds on. Henry didn't yet feel the eyes on him. He felt other pressures. Jimmy's instability. The ongoing shadow of Lufthansa. The risk of Paul discovering the narcotics operation. He assumed the greatest threat came from within the Mafia. He was wrong. The detectives expanded observation to Pittsburgh. Inter-county cooperation is slow at first. A phone call. A shared suspicion. Notes exchanged between departments. Quiet acknowledgement that a supply route might be forming. Pittsburgh authorities had their own concerns. Cocaine shipments moving outward. Certain names appearing repeatedly in low-level arrests. The puzzle pieces didn't fit perfectly yet, but they were starting to resemble a picture. Henry's weekly movements grew slightly bolder as business stabilized. Familiar routes create comfort. Comfort breeds routine. Routine is the enemy of secrecy. Detectives noted that deliveries often coincided with particular days. Late afternoons, early evenings, brief visits to specific houses, conversations that lasted only minutes. No guns drawn, no dramatic busts, just watching. Watching as patience weaponized. One detective described surveillance like fishing. You don't yank the line at the first nibble. You let the fish commit. Henry believed his discipline insulated him. He wasn't flashy. He didn't host wild parties. He kept transactions short. He didn't carry excessive quantities at once. But cumulative observation doesn't require large quantities. It requires repetition. A visitor stopped by 3 times in 1 week for less than 5 minutes each visit. Another arrived nervous, scanning the street before knocking. Henry left shortly afterward and drove in a pattern that suggested a secondary delivery. Patterns. 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 The notebooks filled. Phone records became a point of interest. Subpoenas for call logs. Nothing invasive yet. Just mapping. Henry's phone connected repeatedly to numbers in Pittsburgh. That alone wasn't proof. Business contacts crossed state lines all the time. But paired with observed traffic, it thickened the suspicion. Inside the house, Karen continued managing storage and logistics, unaware that each arrival and departure was being quietly cataloged. There were moments when she sensed something shifting. A car lingering too long across the street. A figure sitting in a parked vehicle without moving. She mentioned it once to Henry. He dismissed it gently. People park. People wait. Don't overthink it. Overthinking can sound like paranoia. But sometimes paranoia is awareness arriving early. The detectives escalated cautiously. They didn't want to spook him. No sudden stops. No aggressive confrontations. Just longer observation windows. They began tracking vehicles leaving Henry's house and following them discreetly to secondary locations. Small dealers. Suburban buyers. Construction sites. The web expanded. Every buyer became a potential leverage point. And leverage is what narcotics cases rely on. Henry's internal confidence remained intact. The pipeline ran smoothly. Payments arrived on time. Associates reported no issues. From his perspective, success equaled security. But success also equaled visibility. Cocaine cases in Nassau County were rising. Public pressure mounted for results. Politicians demanded action. Narcotics detectives felt that subtle urgency. They wanted a case that mattered. Henry Hill was beginning to look like a node worth pulling. One afternoon, a controlled buy was floated as an idea. Not immediately. Too soon. The case needed thickness first. More documentation. More pattern recognition. But the seed was planted. Henry continued to juggle worlds. Meetings with Jimmy. Conversations with Paul. Domestic routines at home. And in between, drug logistics humming. He didn't yet know that 2 parallel investigations were forming around him. One internal, one external. The Mafia measured loyalty. The police measured evidence. And evidence was accumulating quietly. By late 1979, surveillance had become structured. Shifts assigned. Rotations planned. Photographs taken discreetly. Faces logged. Detectives saw Henry laugh with visitors. Saw him lean casually against his car. Saw him appear relaxed. Relaxation is often the final stage before a fall. They didn't rush. Rushing destroys cases. They waited for the right moment, for the pattern to crystallize beyond doubt. Henry's use of cocaine intensified subtly. Not enough to collapse him, but enough to soften his caution. Late nights, short sleep, slightly looser conversations. Cocaine whispers invincibility. Surveillance thrives on arrogance. One evening, detectives watched as a known small-time dealer left Henry's house and was stopped quietly several blocks away. A traffic violation. A routine pretext. A search revealed product. The dealer panicked. Panic creates opportunity. Under pressure, names surface. Henry's name surfaced again. Now it wasn't just pattern. It was connection. The case thickened, but they still waited. They wanted him with product. In motion. In possession. Not just association. Meanwhile, Henry sensed none of this. He felt watched sometimes, but attributed it to general paranoia. The aftermath of Lufthansa. The natural tension of a legal enterprise. He didn't realize he was being watched systematically. Meticulously. Documented. The Pittsburgh pipeline had created momentum. Now it was creating evidence. The detectives understood something Henry underestimated. Mid-level distributors are often the most vulnerable. They move enough weight to matter, but not enough to have impenetrable protection. He wasn't a cartel boss. He wasn't a street corner dealer. He was in between. In between is where cases are built. By early 1980, surveillance had evolved from curiosity to intention. They weren't wondering anymore. They were preparing. Henry still believed the greatest threat to his survival was Jimmy's paranoia or Paul's disapproval. He didn't realize that men in unmarked cars were calculating his schedule more precisely than he was. The house still looked normal. The lawn still trimmed. Children still playing upstairs. But notebooks filled with dates and times sat in narcotics office, waiting for the moment when observation would turn into action. And when action finally came, it wouldn't look like chaos from a movie. It would look like patience reaching its conclusion. The first phase was complete. They were no longer curious. They were convinced. Henry just hadn't caught up yet. And the silence he believed protected him was about to be replaced by something far less forgiving. Chapter 5. The Control Buys. The first crack in the wall didn't come from force. It came from a whisper. A small-time dealer, sweating under fluorescent lights in a Nassau County interrogation room, stared at the table as if it might split open and swallow him. He hadn't planned to talk. He hadn't planned to give anyone up. But fear has a way of rearranging loyalty. On the table sat a small plastic bag. Evidence. Proof. Enough to ruin his year. Maybe more. Across from him, a detective leaned back calmly. No shouting. No threats. Just a quiet suggestion that things could go one of two ways. He mentioned a name again. Henry Hill. Not as a confession. Not yet. More like a direction. A hint. A path. The detective didn't push hard. He didn't need to. The goal wasn't drama. It was cooperation. And cooperation doesn't arrive in a thunderstorm. It arrives in drizzle. Over the next few weeks, that drizzle turned into strategy. Control buys. To the average person, the phrase sounds clinical. Simple. But in narcotics work, a control buy is like setting a trap that looks like opportunity. An informant. Wired. Money marked. Surveillance in place. Every step documented. It is patience wearing a badge. The dealer who had first cracked wasn't flipped dramatically. He wasn't paraded as a snitch. He was handled gently, carefully, given just enough incentive to play along. He didn't have to confess everything. He just had to buy. The first attempt wasn't directly from Henry. That would have been too obvious, too abrupt. Instead, they worked through the lower links in the chain. People who regularly sourced from Henry, but weren't as disciplined. The informant made contact the way he always had. Casual. Familiar. No change in tone. No sign of fear. Henry wasn't present, but his network was. The exchange was small. Ounces, not pounds. Just enough to establish that the supply chain existed. The product was tested. It was real. The detective watched from a distance through binoculars. Not because he needed to see the bag, but because he needed to see the behavior. Who arrived? Who left? Who looked comfortable? The buy was documented in detail. Time stamped. Photographed. The informant's body searched before and after. Money recorded. Clean. Clean buys are gold in narcotics cases. Henry still didn't feel the shift. He heard about the small dealer's arrest. He assumed it was bad luck. Or sloppy behavior. That's how mid-level operators think. Problems below them are individual mistakes, not systemic threats. He didn't realize that the system was tightening upward. The second control buy was more ambitious. This time, the informant insisted on dealing closer to the source. He used familiarity as leverage, claimed he needed higher quality, better pricing. Higher quality meant Henry. The call was placed. Henry agreed. He had no reason not to. The buyer had history, paid on time, caused no issues. Why refuse steady money? Cocaine distribution thrives on trust. Trust is fragile. The day of the second buy, surveillance was layered. Multiple unmarked vehicles. Radios silent. Detectives positioned at key intersections. The informant wore a wire. It wasn't dramatic. No bulky devices taped to his chest like in movies. Just a small transmitter capturing sound. Sound matters. Sound captures tone. Confidence. Language. The meeting spot was neutral. A parking lot near strip mall. Normal. Mundane. Henry arrived composed. Windows down slightly. Music low. He didn't look nervous. Because he wasn't. He believed the system was intact. The exchange was quick. A handshake. A brief lean into the car window. Money passed. Package transferred. To an outside observer, it could have been a friendly exchange. To the detectives, it was confirmation. The product was seized afterward from the informant. Logged. Tested. Cocaine. The case was building. But they didn't arrest him. Not yet. Arrests end operations. Investigations expand them. They want to wait. Repetition. Intent to distribute beyond doubt. They wanted to map the pipeline completely. Meanwhile, Henry returned home that night feeling secure. Another successful deal. Another satisfied buyer. The Pittsburgh shipments still arriving. The machine still humming. He didn't know his voice had just been recorded. He didn't know his movements had been photographed. He didn't know the legal pad with his name now had multiple confirmed entries beside it. The third buy came faster. The informant pushed gently. Asked about larger quantities. Suggested he had new customers. Henry hesitated briefly. Large quantities increase exposure. But large quantities also increase profit. He agreed. The exchange was more substantial. More careful. This time Henry adjusted the location slightly. Not the same parking lot. A nearby residential street. Adaptation can look like caution. But detectives adapt too. They followed from farther back. Rotated vehicles. Avoided patterns. The buy went smoothly. Again, that's the problem with successful control buys. They reinforce the illusion that nothing is wrong. The informant returned, wired again weeks later. This time he asked about Pittsburgh, about supply stability. Henry spoke carefully but confidently. He described the product as consistent, reliable, weekly. Weekly. That word mattered. It established ongoing distribution, intent, regularity, the building blocks of stronger charge. The more buys they completed, the more comfortable Henry became with that particular customer. Comfort is the most dangerous emotion in narcotics. Because comfort blinds. Karen noticed nothing unusual in those weeks. Deliveries continued. Cash counted. Packages stored and moved. She sensed occasional tension in Henry's tone, but attributed it to business scale. Growth brings stress. Stress feels normal when profit is high. But beneath the profit, pressure was thickening. Detectives were now coordinating with federal contacts. Not formally yet, but in conversation, sharing suspicion that this wasn't isolated dealing. The Lufthansa shadow still hovered faintly in law enforcement memory. Henry's name in both worlds created intrigue. Could drugs connect to broader activity? They weren't certain, but the case was growing beyond local interest. Controlled buys became almost routine. Documented. Logged. Each one layering proof like bricks in a wall. Henry had unknowingly become predictable with the informant. Meeting windows narrowed. Language repeated. Confidence increased. Confidence is the final ingredient investigators wait for. The more confident a suspect feels, the less they alter behavior. And alter behavior is what tips suspects off. Henry didn't alter. He didn't suspect. He saw no visible heat. No marked cars. No direct confrontations. The house remained untouched. No search warrants yet. No arrests. From his perspective, success continued uninterrupted. But narcotics cases often move like glaciers. Slow. Heavy. Unstoppable. The informant eventually asked about larger volume. Near pound level. Henry paused longer this time. Weight like that carries consequences if intercepted, but also carries prestige. Mid-level dealers aspire to prove they can handle volume. He agreed to discuss it. The detectives listening through wires felt the shift. That conversation alone elevated the case. They now had voice recordings discussing larger quantities. Intent to distribute significant weight. The threshold had been crossed. And still, they waited. Waiting is discipline. They wanted him with product physically on him. In a vehicle. In motion. Because possession in motion removes ambiguity. Henry had no idea he was nearing that moment. He still believed the most volatile danger in his life was Jimmy's paranoia. The possibility that his drug side business might be discovered internally. He had built elaborate caution around that threat. He had built almost none around law enforcement. Because law enforcement had been invisible. Until now. One evening, after another clean buy, a detective closed his notebook and looked at his partner. He's comfortable, he said quietly. Comfort is when cases ripen. The decision was forming. They would let him move product one more time. Let him feel safe. Let him drive with it. And then they would take him. Henry went home that night, unaware that the investigation had moved from observation to inevitability. The control buys had done their job. Proof stacked. Confidence gained. And the man who believed he was orchestrating a seamless pipeline was about to discover that someone else had been orchestrating something far more patient. The next step wouldn't be another purchase. It would be a stop. And when that stop came, it wouldn't feel random. It would feel like the culmination of months of quiet planning. Henry just didn't know he had already walked into the trap. He thought he was still ahead, but the line had already tightened, and it was about to pull. Chapter 6, April 27, 1980, The Real Arrest. He never saw the signal. There was no dramatic helicopter slicing through the sky. No cinematic panic building as shadows chased him across Long Island. No operatic unraveling in a single frantic afternoon. What happened on April 27, 1980 was quieter and far more deliberate. The morning began like many others had in recent months. Henry woke with a familiar weight behind his eyes. Not exhaustion exactly, but the residue of long nights and short sleep. The house was calm. Children upstairs. Coffee brewing downstairs. Suburban normalcy wrapped around a man who believed he was still several moves ahead of danger. He had deliveries planned. Nothing unusual. Just another rotation. Product moving from storage to buyers. Cash returning to replenish supply. The pipeline humming the way it had for months. But outside, two unmarked vehicles had already taken position. They didn't park directly in front of the house. That would have been sloppy. Instead, they staggered their angles. One down the block. One across the street at a distance that looked casual. Engines off. Windows slightly cracked. Radio silent. Inside those cars, men who had spent months watching him now watched again. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was timing. Henry stepped out mid-morning. Sunglasses. Casual stride. Keys in hand. He carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed routine protected him. Routine had betrayed him. He didn't notice the subtle coordination as his car pulled away from the curb. One unmarked vehicle eased forward. Another hung back. A third waited several intersections away. Surveillance in motion requires choreography. Too close and you spook him. Too far and you lose him. So they rotated. Passed him from car to car like a baton in a relay race. Henry made a brief stop first. Nothing significant. A check-in. A short conversation. No product exchanged. He was calm because he felt normal. He had done this drive dozens of times. The same roads. The same gas stations. The same subtle loops to ensure he wasn't being followed. But the detectives had learned his loops. They expected them. When he circled a block once, they stayed back. When he circled twice, they rotated vehicles. When he paused longer than usual at a light, they adjusted spacing. The game had changed. The game was no longer cat and mouse. It was hunter and prey who didn't realize the hunt had already begun. Henry eventually headed toward a scheduled meeting point. He had product in the car that day. Not an enormous load, but enough. Enough to satisfy the threshold detectives had been waiting for. Enough to turn surveillance into arrest. He parked near a small strip mall. Engines idling. Buyers moved like ghosts in and out of cars. Nothing flamboyant. Nothing loud. The exchange happened quickly. Money for product. A handshake. A nod. Clean. Henry pulled away, feeling steady. Another smooth rotation. Another confirmation that his system worked. He didn't know that a quiet command had just been spoken over a low radio frequency. Take him. The stop didn't explode. It tightened. A vehicle eased in front of him. Another behind. Lights flicked on only at the final second. No sirens screaming across town. Just the sudden realization that space had vanished. He gripped the steering wheel instinctively. Heart rate climbing in an instant. For a split second, he considered accelerating. But acceleration in that moment is confession. He stopped. Doors opened around him with methodical precision. Badges flashed. Voices firm, but not theatrical. Step out of the vehicle. No chaos. No helicopters. Just inevitability. Henry stepped out slowly. eyes scanning instinctively for exits. There were none. The search was immediate. Detectives didn't rush. They knew what they were looking for. They had watched him receive it. Inside the car, concealed but not invisible, they found the product. Cocaine. Bagged. Measured. Enough. Enough to turn months of watching into handcuffs. He didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He processed. That was Henry's strength. Rapid calculation under pressure. In those first seconds, his mind ran through possibilities. Is this random? Is this local? Do they know everything? Or just today? He said little. They placed him in the back of an unmarked car. Windows tinted. Doors heavy. As they drove, he stared straight ahead. The suburban streets looked the same. Lawns still trimmed. Children still playing. Normal life moving undisturbed. But his life had shifted permanently in that moment. At the precinct, processing began with bureaucratic calm. Fingerprints. Photographs. Inventory of personal items. There is something sobering about fluorescent lights and paperwork. It strips away myth. Reduces reputation to lines on a form. Narcotics possession. Intent to distribute. The charges were serious. But what unsettled Henry more wasn't the arrest. It was the tone. The detectives weren't surprised. They weren't scrambling. They were prepared. That preparation meant something. It meant this wasn't a lucky stop. It meant they had been watching. During questioning, they didn't accuse wildly. They didn't guess. They referenced dates, specifics, movements. They mentioned locations he had visited weeks prior. They referenced associates he believed were invisible. That's when the realization began creeping in. This wasn't sudden. This was built. The movie shows frantic paranoia, culminating in a random collapse. Reality was colder. This was a scheduled event in someone else's calendar. He asked about bail. He asked about scope. The answers were measured. He wasn't facing a slap on the wrist. He was facing structured charges backed by months of documentation. Outside, Karen learned of the arrest not through dramatic police raids, but through quiet confirmation. The house wasn't stormed that second, but it was no longer safe. Search warrants were already in motion. The pipeline had been mapped, and mapping means expansion. Back in the interrogation room, detectives laid out fragments of their case without revealing all of it. Control buys, observations, informants. Not enough detail to expose everything, just enough to unsettle him. Henry felt something new then. Not panic. Isolation. Jimmy didn't know yet. Paul didn't know yet. But they would. And how would they react? The narcotics charges weren't just legal problems. They were internal violations. Paul Vario had forbidden drugs for one reason above all others. They bring federal attention. And now Henry had brought it. Sitting there under fluorescent lights, he began calculating not just court outcomes, but mob consequences. Would Paul see this as a mistake? Or betrayal? Would Jimmy see weakness? Or liability? The arrest itself had been clean, professional, inevitable. But the aftershocks would ripple far beyond Nassau County. That afternoon, as paperwork concluded and holding arrangements were made, Henry replayed the stop in his mind. The choreography, the calm, the absence of chaos. He had not been hunted impulsively. He had been harvested. Outside, detectives finalized reports. Evidence logged. Product weighed. Statements recorded. The case was solid. And it was only the beginning. Because possession was one charge. Distribution was another. Conspiracy was heavier still. Henry would be released pending proceedings. Bail arranged. But release doesn't erase exposure. It amplifies it. When he stepped back into open air hours later, the sky looked unchanged. But every parked car now felt suspicious. Every passing glance heavier. He returned home, knowing something irreversible had occurred. The pipeline was compromised. The illusion of invisibility shattered. And the most dangerous question was no longer what the police knew. It was what Jimmy would think. Because law enforcement arrests with paperwork. The Mafia respond with silence. That night, as darkness settled over Long Island, Henry sat alone longer than usual. The arrest hadn't been loud. It had been precise. And precision meant preparation. He realized then that the danger he had feared least, the quiet patience of narcotics detectives, had proven the most lethal. But he still didn't know how much they had. And he still believed, somewhere deep inside, that he could maneuver out of it. He didn't yet understand that the stop on April 27 wasn't just an arrest. It was the first crack in a structure that had protected him his entire life. And once a crack forms, pressure does the rest. The control buys had done their work. The surveillance had matured. The pipeline had been traced. And Henry Hill, who believed he was managing risk carefully, had just discovered that risk had been managing him. The story didn't explode that day. It tightened. And tightening never stops on its own. It waits for the next move. And the next move would come from inside his own world. Because arrest is one thing. Abandonment is another. And Henry was about to learn the difference. Chapter 7. The Search Warrants. The knock came harder this time. Not the polite tap of a neighbor. Not the casual ring of a friend stopping by. This knock carried authority. Measured. Intentional. Backed by paper and ink and the weight of months. Karen was home when it happened. The children were inside. The house looked the same as it always had. Curtains drawn halfway. Dishes drying by the sink. The quiet hum of suburban life continuing without warning. When she opened the door, she saw badges. Not one. Several. There is a moment in every raid when reality compresses into a single breath. A split second where denial tries to form and fails. They didn't push their way in. They stepped in with paperwork. Search warrant. The words are sterile, but they carry force. Karen stepped back slowly, eyes scanning instinctively, calculating what was inside the house. What had been moved? What hadn't? What might still be hidden? She had lived in dual awareness for months. The kitchen as a family space. The kitchen as a storage node. The bedroom as sanctuary. The bedroom as concealment. Now those layers were about to peel apart. The detectives moved methodically. No shouting. No dramatic overturning of furniture. Just quiet efficiency. Drawers opened. Closets inspected. Boxes lifted and emptied. Every compartment in the house treated not as domestic space, but as potential evidence. Karen watched from the living room, hands folded tightly together, heart pounding in a rhythm that felt too loud for the silence in the room. The officers were calm. Calm means confidence. Confidence means preparation. They weren't guessing where to look. They had patterns mapped. One officer headed straight toward a particular cabinet. Another toward a bedroom dresser. They didn't waste time in places that were clean. They focused on places that had been observed indirectly through months of surveillance. Inside a container tucked away behind ordinary objects, they found product. Cocaine. Packaged. Measured. Not residue. Not trace. Distribution level quantity. The discovery didn't come with dramatic announcement. Just a glance between officers. A nod. Logged. Bagged. Photographed. Karen's throat tightened. This wasn't random discovery. This was confirmation. They had known enough to come prepared. The house that had felt controlled, managed, compartmentalized, now felt transparent. Like living inside glass. As the search continued, they located paraphernalia consistent with distribution. Scales. Packaging materials. Cash in envelopes. Records scribbled in shorthand that might not have meant much to a casual observer, but meant plenty to narcotics detectives. Each item became a brick. Brick by brick, the case thickened. Karen didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She stood in stillness, absorbing the shift. Because she understood something Henry was only beginning to realize. This wasn't a one-day arrest. This was an operation. Henry sat in custody elsewhere, unaware of the precise moment the house was being dismantled piece by piece. He knew a search was possible, but knowing something abstractly and seeing it executed are different experiences. By the time he learned the warrant had been served, evidence had already been cataloged. He asked what they found. The answer was measured. Enough. Enough to transform possession into distribution. Enough to move from misdemeanor to serious felony. Enough to make the situation heavier than he had calculated. Inside the house, detectives documented everything. Photographs from multiple angles. Serial numbers on currency. Locations of concealment. They treated the space not as a family home, but as a crime scene. Karen's dual identity collapsed in that moment. No longer wife managing logistics. No longer suburban mother with a secret. She was now a subject in a narcotics investigation. Her name would appear on reports. Her involvement, once quiet and controlled, now visible on paper. There's a specific terror in watching strangers catalog your life. Not just the illegal parts. Everything. Closets opened. Jewelry inspected. Photographs lifted and replaced. Every intimate detail of a home examined through a forensic lens. It strips privacy in ways handcuffs cannot. Outside, neighbors watch from behind curtains. Suburban curiosity flickering. The illusion of invisibility shattered publicly. The detectives left with boxes. Evidence secured. Documentation complete. They didn't need to arrest Karen immediately. That decision would depend on leverage. Leverage is currency in narcotics cases. And leverage had just multiplied. When Henry finally returned home later, the air felt different. Drawers slightly displaced. Cabinets imperfectly closed. A subtle disarray that signaled intrusion. Karen's face told him everything before she spoke. They found it. He stood still for a moment. Because this was the confirmation he had hoped to avoid. The arrest alone might have been contained. The search changed the landscape. Now the evidence extended beyond his vehicle. It reached into his house. His family. His wife. The pipeline had been traced all the way to its core. He walked through the room slowly. Not to check what remained, but to process what had been exposed. He had believed compartmentalization would protect them. That the house could serve as both sanctuary and storage without consequence. But sanctuaries do not coexist peacefully with distribution hubs. He began recalculating again. What do they know? Who talked? How much product was seized? Was this still local? Or had it grown federal? Because the presence of structured warrants suggested more than a single-day arrest. It suggested a case. And cases escalate. Paul Vario would hear about this. Jimmy Burke would hear about this. In their world, narcotics weren't just illegal. They were radioactive. They drew heat not just to the individual, but to the crew. And heat endangers everyone. Henry knew that mob discipline regarding drugs was not theoretical. Men had been punished severely for less. He sat at the kitchen table that night in the same chair where he had planned deliveries, feeling something new. Not panic. Exposure. The operation was no longer contained within trusted circles. It was documented in police reports. Once documented, it becomes narrative. Narratives travel. Karen spoke quietly. What happens now? He didn't answer immediately, because for the first time in months, he didn't have a confident projection to offer. The evidence seized meant charges would likely expand. Intent to distribute strengthened. Conspiracy possible. The control buys he didn't yet fully understand would surface in court. Voice recordings perhaps. Photographs. He felt the ground shifting beneath both worlds. The legal world tightening with paperwork. The mob world tightening with suspicion. The search warrant had done more than seize drugs. It had shattered his invisibility. And invisibility was the foundation of his survival. He considered reaching out to Paul. But how do you explain a narcotics warrant when drugs were explicitly forbidden? You don't. You wait. And waiting is suffocating. The next days moved slowly. Lawyers consulted. Bail discussed. Charges reviewed. But in the background, something else was forming. Federal interest. Because cases involving repeated controlled buys and interstate supply routes rarely remain purely local. They attract attention. And attention at that level does not dissipate easily. Henry still believed maneuvering was possible, that he could handle the charges, that maybe the evidence could be challenged, that maybe associates would stay silent. But he had underestimated one element. Once informants enter a case, silence fractures. He didn't yet know how many fractures existed. The search warrant had transformed suspicion into substance. Evidence now sat in lockers, cataloged, measured, waiting for courtrooms. And inside the Mafia, word began circulating. Not loudly, not publicly, just quiet acknowledgement that Henry had crossed a line. Narcotics, the forbidden word. The search wasn't just a legal escalation. It was a cultural violation. He had brought federal heat to a crew that prided itself on insulation. And insulation, once burned, rarely restores fully. That night, As the house settled into uneasy quiet, Henry stared at the ceiling longer than usual. The pipeline was broken, the house compromised, the illusion gone. But he still believed, somewhere in his mind, that loyalty might buffer him. That past service, past earnings, past trust, might soften the reaction. He didn't yet understand how cold the response would be. Because in the Mafia, mistakes are judged not by intention, but by exposure. And exposure had just entered his front door with a search warrant in hand. The arrest had been a crack. The search was the fracture. And fracture spread. He was no longer just facing charges. He was facing isolation. He just didn't know how complete that isolation was about to become. The house felt smaller, quieter, vulnerable. And for the first time, Henry Hill began to sense that the most dangerous consequence of his drug empire wouldn't come from a courtroom. It would come from silence. And silence had already begun. Chapter 8. Paul Vario cuts him off. The first sign wasn't a threat. It was the absence of a phone call. Henry sat at the small metal table in the holding area, hands folded loosely in front of him, staring at a wall that had been painted too many times. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, like a tired machine that refused to shut off. He had been through arrest before. He knew the routine. Paperwork, bail, lawyers, the quiet understanding that someone on the outside was moving pieces to protect him. This time, it felt different. In the old days, word would travel fast. Someone would show up. A nod, a handshake, a lawyer already briefed and paid. That's how it worked in his world. When one of your own got caught, you didn't leave him exposed. You didn't let him wonder. You made sure he knew he wasn't alone. Hours passed. No familiar face. No envelope delivered to smooth things over. Just silence. Henry told himself not to read into it. It was early. News hadn't fully circulated yet. Paul Vario was careful, calculating. He wouldn't react impulsively. But Paul also had rules. And Henry had broken the most important one. When bail was finally arranged through his own efforts and legal maneuvering, it didn't feel like rescue. It felt like improvisation. He walked out of the precinct with the same steady stride he always used. But inside something had shifted. The weight of the search warrant, the evidence, the control buys he still didn't fully grasp. It all pressed on him. Still, he believed in the old structure. He believed in hierarchy, in earned loyalty. In the years he had delivered envelopes and risked his neck on hijackings and robberies. He had been valuable. He had made people rich. That had to count for something. He expected Paul to call. The call didn't come. Days passed. Henry sat in his living room, cigarette burning down unnoticed between his fingers, staring at the phone like it was a living thing that had decided to betray him. Karen moved through the house with a tension that felt like static. The children sensed it too, even if they couldn't name it. Finally, he reached out. The meeting was brief. Paul Vario didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't lecture. That would have been easier to process. Instead, he was calm in a way that felt colder than anger. He listened as Henry explained the arrest, downplayed the scale, suggested it was manageable, temporary, just bad timing. Paul's face didn't change. When he spoke, it was slow, controlled. You were told. That was all he said at first. No drugs, no heroin, no cocaine, no heat. Henry tried to explain that it was separate, independent, that it hadn't touched crew money, that it hadn't endangered anyone else. Paul didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Separate doesn't exist, he said quietly. When they look at you, they look at all of us. That was the core of it. It wasn't about morality. It wasn't about purity. It was about exposure. Drugs pulled federal attention like gravity pulls a falling body. Once it starts, it doesn't stop easily. Paul had survived decades by avoiding that kind of spotlight. He had built insulation around his crew like a careful architect, and Henry had drilled a hole through it. The verdict wasn't delivered dramatically. It arrived in fragments. No financial assistance. No legal funding. No protection money for Karen if things tightened. You handle your problem, Paul said. The words landed harder than any slap. In that world, being cut off wasn't just financial inconvenience. It was a signal. It meant you were on your own. It meant the umbrella had closed. And umbrellas matter when storms are coming. Henry left that meeting feeling something he hadn't felt since he was a kid. Small. Not powerless. Not yet. But separated. Isolation doesn't arrive with sirens. It creeps in like fog. He had expected Paul to be angry. To discipline him. Maybe to fine him. He hadn't expected to be abandoned. Back at home, Karen asked the question she had been holding in for days. What did he say? Henry hesitated. He wanted to project control. Strength. But the truth tasted bitter. He's not helping, he said finally. Karen didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at him. And in that stare was something heavier than panic. It was realization. The crew wasn't coming to save them. Money tightened quickly. Legal fees stacked like bricks. Court dates loomed. The narcotics case wasn't small. The search warrant had strengthened it. Distribution charges carried serious weight. Without backing, Henry felt exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. The Mafia functions like a machine. When you're aligned, it moves smoothly. When you're misaligned, the machine doesn't slow down for you. It keeps moving, and you're left outside of it. Whispers began circulating. Not loud, not public, but present. Henry's drug involvement wasn't rumor anymore. It was fact. Arrests have a way of solidifying gossip. And in that world, narcotics were viewed as contamination. Not because they were immoral, but because they were uncontrollable. Paul's decision to cut him off wasn't just punishment. It was preservation. Preserve the crew. Sacrifice the liability. Henry understood that logic intellectually, but emotionally it stung. He had risked himself for them. Delivered scores. Participated in Lufthansa. Handled dangerous situations with calm precision. Now, when he needed insulation, he had none. He reached out to Jimmy next. Jimmy's response was different. Less formal. Less structured. But colder in its own way. Jimmy didn't discuss legal strategy. He didn't offer reassurance. He asked questions. Quiet ones. How bad is it? What do they have? Who knows? The tone wasn't supportive. It was analytical. Henry recognized that tone. It was the same one Jimmy used after Lufthansa when men started disappearing. The tone of assessing risk. And in that assessment, Henry felt himself being measured. Not as a friend. As a variable. The realization began forming slowly. Without Paul's backing, without crew money funding his defense, he was financially exposed. Without visible protection, he looked vulnerable. And vulnerability in that world often invited solutions that weren't court-based. He tried to convince himself that history mattered. That shared past created loyalty. But history fades quickly when exposure threatens present survival. Days turned into weeks. No envelopes arrived. No quiet reassurance from above. Instead, there was distance. Distance is a language in the Mafia. It says more than threats ever could. Henry began calculating differently now. Not just legal outcomes. Not just court strategies. But personal safety. He knew what had happened to others after Lufthansa. Men who knew too much. Men who became nervous. Men who became potential risks. They had been cleaned up. And now he had narcotic charges. Search warrants. Control buys. Evidence stacking. If federal prosecutors leaned hard enough, they could pressure him. If Jimmy believed he might talk, that created another problem. For the first time, Henry felt squeezed from both sides. The law tightening. The crew stepping back. Karen saw it too. The shift in his posture. The longer silences. The way he stared at nothing. She asked quietly one night, "Are we safe?" He didn't answer immediately. Because safety had always meant two things in his world. Protection from the law. Protection from his own people. Now both felt uncertain. Paul's silence became louder with each passing day. No visits. No financial lifeline. Just distance. Distance that felt permanent. Henry began to understand something painful. He had miscalculated. He believed he could operate independently and still rely on the structure when things went wrong. But independence and profit doesn't guarantee loyalty in crisis. He had made money outside the hierarchy. Now he was outside it. And the case against him was not small. Nassau County charges were serious. Intent to distribute carried heavy sentences. And there were murmurs of federal interest. Interstate supply routes don't stay local forever. Without backing, he faced that storm alone. The realization didn't explode. It settled. slow and suffocating. He wasn't just dealing with a narcotics case. He was dealing with abandonment. And abandonment in that world could turn lethal. Because if Jimmy decided he was a liability, there would be no warning. No dramatic confrontation. Just absence. The same absence Paul had delivered. Only colder. Henry sat alone late one night, staring at the kitchen table where so many deals had been planned. The house felt smaller now. The walls closer. The air heavier. He had believed the arrest was the turning point. It wasn't. This was. The moment he realized he was no longer protected, no longer insulated, no longer guaranteed survival by the very structure he had served for years. And when a man in that world understands he stands alone, he begins thinking differently. Not about loyalty, not about pride, but about survival. The cutoff wasn't loud. It was quiet, which made it far more dangerous. Because silence doesn't argue. It erases. Chapter 9. Jimmy Burke's reputation for cleaning house. The first body after Lufthansa didn't shock anyone. It unsettled them. There's a difference. In that world, violence wasn't foreign. It wasn't theatrical. It was administrative. Problems appeared. Problems were solved. And the solving didn't always require discussion. But after the robbery in December of 1978, something changed in Jimmy Burke. The money had been monumental. More cash than most men would see in a lifetime, taken in less than an hour from an airport terminal that was supposed to be secure. The job had been flawless, precise, surgical, and that precision bred paranoia. Because when you pull off something that large, the only real threat left isn't the police. It's your own people. The truck driver who got too flashy. The associate who bought a new car too soon. The man who talked too freely at a bar after a few drinks. Loose ends. Jimmy didn't tolerate loose ends. They began disappearing quietly. One man found dead in a van. Another shot behind a bar. Another simply gone. Each death wasn't loud. It was clean, efficient, a removal. And everyone understood what it meant without needing explanation. You don't talk. You don't attract attention. And you don't become a liability. Henry Hill watched it unfold in real time. He wasn't naive. He had known Jimmy for years. He had admired him, even. Jimmy was charismatic, intelligent, fearless in ways that commanded loyalty. But fear and loyalty can blur into something else when money and paranoia mix. After Lufthansa, Jimmy didn't just look at men as partners. He looked at them as variables. And variables get eliminated. Henry had always believed he was different, trusted, valuable, useful. He had helped plan, helped coordinate, helped execute. He had been inside the inner circle. But now he had narcotic charges, search warrants, evidence stacking. And in Jimmy's world, that translated into one word: exposure. Exposure is contagious. If Henry talked, intentionally or not, the ripple effect could reach far beyond cocaine. It could brush against hijackings, against Lufthansa, against things buried deeper than narcotics. Jimmy understood that better than anyone. And Henry knew it. The silence from Paul Vario had already shaken him. But Jimmy's silence felt different. Less distant. More calculating. When Henry met with Jimmy after the arrest and search warrant, the conversation didn't turn dramatic. There were no threats. No raised voices. Just measured questions. How bad is it? What do they have? Are you solid? That last question lingered longer than the others. Are you solid? It wasn't about drugs. It wasn't about loyalty in the abstract. It was about pressure. Could Henry withstand it? Jimmy had seen men fold before. Not necessarily because they were weak, but because prison changes arithmetic. 20 years feels different when you're facing it directly. And Henry's case wasn't minor. Distribution, controlled buys, interstate supply routes. That kind of exposure invited federal interest. And federal interest didn't fade easily. Jimmy knew that. Henry insisted he was fine, that he could handle it, that the case was manageable. He projected steadiness the way he always had. Calm voice, direct eye contact. But projection doesn't erase reputation. Jimmy's reputation wasn't built on second chances. It was built on prevention. Prevention in that world means eliminating potential problems before they mature. Henry began replaying the disappearances after Lufthansa in his head. The bartender who got sloppy. the driver who made too much noise, the associate who looked nervous. Each one had once believed they were safe too. Each one had once sat across from Jimmy and felt that same steady gaze. And then they were gone. Henry tried not to let those thoughts surface too often, but they did. Late at night, in the quiet between phone calls, in the spaces where confidence thins. He had broken Paul's rule about narcotics. That alone created distance. But Jimmy's calculations were colder. Drugs weren't just forbidden. They were leverage. Law enforcement loves drug cases because drug cases generate informants. Informants generate bigger cases. Bigger cases generate federal involvement. If Henry ever faced a moment where cooperation meant survival, Jimmy couldn't rely on old loyalty to stop him. The thought alone made Henry's chest tighten. Not because he planned to talk, but because Jimmy might assume he would. Assumptions kill in that world. The crew's whispers grew subtle but sharper. Henry could feel it in the way conversations shifted when he entered rooms, in the way certain men avoided extended eye contact. He wasn't ostracized, not openly, but he wasn't embraced either. He was being watched, not by detectives, by his own people. Jimmy's pattern after Lufthansa had been simple. Identify risk, remove risk, restore calm. Henry now represented risk. He tried to convince himself that history mattered, that years of shared operations and trust insulated him. But history hadn't saved the others. The men who vanished after Lufthansa had also shared history. Shared laughs, shared scores, shared loyalty. And still, they had become liabilities. Henry began noticing small changes. Meetings he wasn't invited to. Information that reached him secondhand. A subtle shrinking of his role. In a mafia, reduction often precedes removal. He thought about the search warrant again. About how easily law enforcement had entered his house. About the evidence they had gathered. About the charges forming. If prosecutors leaned hard enough, they could offer deals. Deals create temptation. Temptation creates fear. Fear creates uncertainty. Jimmy didn't like uncertainty. The idea that Henry might someday sit in a federal office being offered a path out. That possibility alone might be enough to justify preemptive action. Henry didn't need explicit threats to understand that. He had seen how Jimmy operated when paranoia took root. Jimmy didn't rage. He adjusted. An adjustment often meant finality. Karen sensed the shift too. She noticed Henry checking the rearview mirror more frequently. Not for police. For something else. One night, she asked him directly, "Do you think he would?" Henry didn't ask who she meant. He knew. He paused longer than he intended. Jimmy had been friend and mentor. The man who pulled him deeper into the world. The man who trusted him with major scores. But Jimmy had also demonstrated that friendship was conditional. Conditional on stability. Conditional on silence. Conditional on usefulness. Henry was no longer stable. He was legally compromised. And compromised men create risk. The arithmetic was simple, even if the emotions were complex. If Henry went to prison for decades, he could talk. If Henry feared prison enough, he might talk. If Henry suspected Jimmy might eliminate him, he might talk first. That chain of possibilities alone was dangerous. Jimmy's reputation for cleaning house wasn't rumor. It was documented in absence. Men who became inconvenient disappeared. Henry found himself measuring his own convenience. Was he still valuable? Or had he become disposable? There is a specific terror in realizing you're no longer an asset, but a question mark. A question mark in Jimmy Burke's mind was not a safe place to be. He began calculating escape routes in his head. Not literally. Not yet. But hypothetically. What if the charges escalate? What if federal time becomes real? What if Jimmy decides the simplest solution is removal? The fear wasn't dramatic. It was steady. Steady fear is more corrosive than sudden panic, because it never fully leaves. Jimmy remained outwardly calm. Meetings continued. Conversations remained polite. But beneath the surface, Henry sensed evaluation, like being weighed on a scale you cannot see. He tried to reassure himself. He hadn't talked. He wasn't planning to talk. He could fight the charges. He could manage it. But managing law enforcement and managing mob suspicion are two separate battles. And he was fighting both. The men who vanished after Lufthansa had probably felt the same quiet dread in their final weeks. The sense that the air around them had changed. That glances lingered too long. That invitations thinned. Henry had once watched that pattern from the outside. Now he was inside it. And inside, it feels colder. He understood something now that he hadn't fully grasped before. The real danger wasn't prison alone. It was the intersection of prison and paranoia. If Jimmy believed Henry might fold under pressure, he might remove the pressure entirely. Henry began sleeping less. Not because of cocaine this time, but because his mind replayed scenarios in loops. Car following him at night. Meeting invitation in a quiet place. A friendly conversation that ended differently. He knew too much. About Lufthansa. About hijackings. About internal dynamics. Knowledge is currency until it becomes liability. Jimmy's reputation was built on preventing liabilities. Henry could feel the edge approaching. Not a cliff yet, but a narrowing path. He had once believed the biggest threat to his survival was law enforcement. Now he wasn't so sure. Because law enforcement follows procedure. Jimmy followed instinct. And instinct, when combined with paranoia, moves fast. Henry had stepped into narcotics for profit and independence. Now that independence had isolated him. Paul had stepped back. Jimmy was measuring. And Henry stood between the legal storm and the internal one. The irony was suffocating. The same man who had survived dangerous hijackings and major robberies now felt most vulnerable in silence. No one had threatened him. No one had raised a gun. But the absence of reassurance was louder than any weapon. Jimmy Burke's reputation wasn't just about violence. It was about efficiency. Problems removed. Noise reduced. Risk minimized. And Henry was becoming a problem that made noise. He didn't know when the decision would come, or if it already had. But he knew one thing with clarity now. If survival ever required choosing between loyalty and life, Jimmy would choose survival. The question was whether Henry would be given that same choice. Chapter 10. The federal indictment looms. The letter didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived in an envelope. Thick. Official. Heavy in the hand before it was even opened. Henry stared at it longer than he needed to. The return address told him everything without spelling it out. This wasn't just Nassau County anymore. This wasn't just a local narcotics case tied to a single traffic stop and a few control buys. This was bigger. When he slit the envelope open and unfolded the papers inside, the language felt colder than the arrest ever had. Words like conspiracy, interstate distribution, federal jurisdiction. Federal. That word changed the atmosphere in the room. Local cases can be negotiated, managed. Plea deals shaped by familiar prosecutors who understand neighborhood dynamics. Federal cases operate differently. They build slowly and strike with weight. They don't rush. They prepare. Henry read the lines again. The controlled buys he hadn't fully understood were laid out in sterile detail. Dates, locations, quantities, references to cooperating witnesses without naming them. They had more than he thought. The realization didn't hit him all at once. It unfolded gradually, like fog filling a valley. Interstate supply. That meant Pittsburgh. That meant the pipeline wasn't just suspected. It was documented. Federal prosecutors don't involve themselves unless the pattern is clear, unless the case is solid, unless the target matters. Henry felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with cocaine or paranoia. This wasn't a small fight anymore. He called his lawyer immediately. The conversation was brief and uncomfortably honest. Federal time isn't symbolic. It's measured in decades. Guidelines. Mandatory minimums. Sentencing charts that don't bend easily. The lawyer didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. He simply explained the math. If convicted on conspiracy and distribution charges at the quantities implied, Henry wasn't looking at a short stretch. He was looking at a future defined by concrete walls. Concrete doesn't negotiate. Henry sat in silence after the call ended. The house felt smaller again. He had survived street violence, hijackings, risky meetings in dark parking lots. But prison, long-term federal prison, is a different kind of threat. It doesn't kill you quickly. It stretches you thin over years. He thought about the children, about Karen, about birthdays missed, seasons lost, And then another thought crept in. If the federal government was involved, that meant pressure. And pressure creates leverage. Leverage makes men talk. Jimmy would know that. Paul would know that. The indictment wasn't public yet, but it would be. Word would travel. And once it did, Henry's position inside the crew would shift further. He had crossed from local trouble into federal exposure. Exposure in that world doesn't just make you vulnerable to prosecutors. It makes you radioactive to your own people. He reached out again. Not for money this time. For reassurance. The responses were cooler than before. Jimmy's voice over the phone carried something new. Not anger. Not even distance. Calculation. Federal? That was the first word Jimmy said after Henry explained. Federal cases don't fade quietly. They dig. They subpoena. They flip small fish into bigger ones. Henry could almost hear the gears turning on the other end of the line. He insisted he was solid. That he would fight it. That he wasn't going anywhere. But words mean less when the stakes rise. The indictment meant prosecutors believed they had enough to win. And if they believed that, they would press hard. Pressing hard means offering deals. Deals mean cooperation. And cooperation in that world is a death sentence of another kind. Henry's nights grew longer. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the timeline. The controlled buys. The surveillance. The arrest. The search warrant. It had been systematic. He had been blind. He thought back to the days after Lufthansa. The bodies. The disappearances. The way Jimmy had cleaned house to eliminate risk. Now Henry was a walking risk. Not because he had talked, but because he could. The indictment didn't just threaten prison. It threatened perception. If Jimmy believed federal prosecutors would offer Henry a path out in exchange for information, Jimmy might decide not to wait for that offer. The logic was brutal, but simple. Remove the possibility. Henry began noticing cars again. Not necessarily law enforcement this time. Just unfamiliar vehicles parked too long. Faces he didn't recognize. Was it paranoia? Maybe. But paranoia in his world wasn't irrational. It was survival instinct sharpening. Karen saw the indictment too. The language terrified her more than the arrest had. She read phrases about sentencing ranges and mandatory time and felt the floor tilt beneath her. This wasn't about fines. This was about losing him for years. She asked the question he had been avoiding. What if they offer you something? He didn't answer immediately, because he knew what she meant. Federal prosecutors don't waste strong cases. They use them. They leverage them. If Henry could provide value beyond narcotics, value tied to larger crimes, they would consider it. And he could provide value. He knew about Lufthansa, about hijackings, about inner workings that weren't on police reports yet. That knowledge had once been power. Now it was currency. The problem with currency is that someone always wants to spend it. He told her he wouldn't talk. That loyalty mattered. That he could fight. But even as he spoke, he felt uncertainty creeping in. Not because he wanted to betray anyone, but because he wanted to live. The indictment loomed like a storm cloud that wouldn't dissipate. Court dates scheduled. Legal motions filed. Prosecutors building arguments brick by brick. The crew's distance widened subtly. Conversations shortened. Invitations reduced. No one said the word liability, but it hung in the air. Henry understood something painful now. The indictment didn't just threaten his freedom. It altered his status. In the Mafia, perception is survival. And the perception forming around him was dangerous. He began thinking in contingency plans. What if he lost? What if the evidence was overwhelming? What if the sentencing guidelines didn't bend? 20 years. 30. More. Time measured not in months, but in decades. The thought hollowed him. He had always believed he could outmaneuver problems. Outsmart them. Navigate around them. But federal cases aren't street problems. They don't rely on intimidation or negotiation in back rooms. They rely on documentation. Evidence. Structure. Structure beats swagger. And he was facing structure. He met with his lawyer again. Asked blunt questions. What's the worst case? What's realistic? The answers weren't comforting. The controlled buys alone were strong. The interstate element made it heavier. The search warrant added substance. If the prosecution added conspiracy tied to broader criminal activity, it could expand dramatically. That word, conspiracy, echoed in his head. Conspiracy doesn't require you to commit every act. It requires agreement, participation, knowledge. And Henry had plenty of that. The indictment wasn't final conviction, but it was a declaration. We have enough. Enough to charge. Enough to threaten. Enough to pressure. Henry walked out of the lawyer's office that day, feeling the weight of inevitability pressing harder. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider a path he had always dismissed. What if survival didn't look like loyalty? The thought made him uncomfortable, almost ashamed. But shame doesn't shorten sentences. The federal indictment had changed the battlefield. He was no longer juggling local charges and internal suspicion. He was standing at the edge of something larger, and he could feel the squeeze tightening from both sides. Law enforcement building leverage. Jimmy evaluating risk. Paul remaining silent. The storm hadn't hit yet, but was no longer distant. It was overhead, and Henry understood something with terrifying clarity. If he didn't make a decision soon, someone else would make one for him. Chapter 11. The moment he realized he was alone. The realization didn't come in a courtroom. It didn't arrive during an interrogation. It came in a quiet parking lot. Henry had been asked to meet. Nothing unusual. Meetings were the currency of that life. You meet to talk business, to smooth misunderstandings, to reassure, to measure loyalty. He had done it 1,000 times before. But this time, something felt different. The call had been brief. Too brief. The tone neutral. Too neutral. No specifics. Just a time and a place. Henry drove there alone. He always drove alone. That was the rule. Too many cars create attention. Too many witnesses create risk. As he pulled into the lot, he scanned instinctively. Old habits. A few cars parked. One idling near the far end. Windows tinted. He parked. Waited. Minutes passed. The idling car didn't move. A second car entered the lot slowly. Too slowly. Henry's pulse quickened. Not dramatically. Just enough. He had been in parking lots like this before. After Lufthansa. After smaller jobs. Some of those meetings had ended normally. Others had ended with someone never going home. He thought about the men who had vanished. The bartender. The driver. The associate who had gotten too nervous. They had likely received similar calls. Similar neutral tones. Similar invitations. The idling car's engine cut off. No one stepped out. The second car circled once and left. Henry's instincts, sharpened by years in the underworld, screamed quietly. This wasn't about business. It was about assessment. Or worse. He started his engine again without stepping out. Didn't peel away. Didn't draw attention. Just eased out slowly. As he turned onto the main road, he checked the rearview mirror. The idling car remained parked. But something had shifted inside him. He understood now. He wasn't being reassured. He was being evaluated. The indictment had changed his status. The search warrant had damaged his insulation. Paul's silence had stripped protection. And Jimmy's reputation hovered like a shadow over every quiet meeting. Henry didn't know for certain that the parking lot had been a setup. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the meeting had been delayed. But survival in that world isn't about certainty. It's about instinct. And his instinct told him something clear. He was no longer safe by default. He drove aimlessly for a while after that, trying to slow his breathing. He replayed the last few weeks in his head. The indictment. The cool conversations. The lack of financial support. The subtle distancing. It formed a pattern. And patterns don't lie. Back at home, Karen saw in his face before he spoke. What happened? He hesitated. Nothing. But nothing carried weight. Because he understood something now that he had resisted admitting. If Jimmy believed he might cooperate under federal pressure, the simplest solution would be to remove the risk before it matured. And Henry was ripe with risk. He knew about Lufthansa. He knew about internal operations. He knew about crimes that hadn't been fully documented. Federal prosecutors loved leverage. Jimmy hated leverage. That intersection was lethal. Henry had always believed that loyalty ran both ways. That shared history created bonds strong enough to withstand legal trouble. But history fades quickly when survival is on the line. He remembered the day Paul cut him off financially. The calm voice. The quiet withdrawal. That had been the first crack. The parking lot felt like the second. He began seeing the crew differently. Every smile measured. Every handshake analyzed. Was it genuine? Or was it final courtesy? There's a specific isolation that comes when you realize the structure you serve no longer sees you as protected. He thought about going to Jimmy directly, confronting the tension head-on. But confrontation in that world can accelerate outcomes. If Jimmy had already decided Henry was too risky, pushing might hasten the conclusion. So he waited. And waiting is torture when you suspect someone is weighing your existence. The indictment moved forward. Court dates approached. Federal prosecutors began signaling that they were interested in conversations. Not explicitly offering deals yet, but hinting at flexibility. Henry could feel the squeeze tightening. He imagined the scenario, clearly now. Federal time looming. Mob suspicion growing. A quiet invitation to a meeting that might not end with conversation. He had seen how Jimmy operated. Clean. Efficient. Minimal noise. The thought of being erased not by the government, but by his own crew hollowed him in a way prison hadn't. Prison was slow death of freedom. Mob retaliation was immediate. He started taking precautions. Not dramatic ones. Just subtle adjustments. Varying routes. Avoiding isolated meeting spots. Limiting spontaneous appearances. Karen noticed. You think he would really? She couldn't finish the sentence. Henry didn't answer directly. But in his silence was confirmation. He realized something that felt like betrayal. The fear of his own people now outweighed his fear of the federal government. That was the tipping point. The government wanted information. Jimmy wanted silence. And silence might mean a grave. One evening, sitting alone at the kitchen table, Henry stared at the same surface where so many deals had been planned. The wood felt colder under his fingertips. He had always believed that his intelligence, his value, his history made him indispensable. Now he saw the flaw in that thinking. No one is indispensable when they become a liability. And liability in that world is terminal. The realization wasn't loud. It didn't explode into panic. It settled into him like frost. He was alone. Paul had stepped back. Jimmy was calculating. The crew was distancing. The federal government was circling. He stood at the center of converging threats with no umbrella. For the first time in his life, he felt the absence of protection completely. No structure, no shield, no guarantee. He thought about his children sleeping upstairs, about Karen's face tight with unspoken fear. Loyalty had defined him for years. It had given him identity, belonging, purpose. But loyalty does not protect you from execution, and loyalty does not shorten federal sentences. The realization crystallized slowly, but unmistakably. If survival required choosing between a code and a pulse, he knew which one his instincts would favor. He hadn't made the decision yet, but the ground had shifted. The moment in the parking lot had cracked something open inside him. He no longer believed he was protected. He no longer believed history guaranteed mercy. He understood now that the only person invested in his survival might be himself. And that understanding changes everything. Chapter 12. Ed McDonald makes the offer. The room was quiet enough to hear the air conditioning breathe. Henry sat across from two men in suits who didn't look like street cops. They didn't lean back casually. They didn't try to intimidate him with volume. They carried themselves with a different kind of authority, the kind that comes from knowing the clock is on your side. On the table between them were folders. Not thick binders. Not dramatic stacks of evidence. Just neat files. Organized. Labeled. Federal. Henry had been in interrogation rooms before. He knew the choreography. The push. The bluff. The pressure tactics designed to crack a suspect in the first hour. This wasn't that. This felt patient. One of the men introduced himself clearly. Assistant United States Attorney. Ed McDonald. The name didn't mean much to Henry at first. It wasn't famous in his world. It didn't carry the kind of street reputation Jimmy did. But the tone carried weight. Measured. Controlled. Calm. Calm means leverage. Henry leaned back slightly, projecting the same steady posture he had used for years. He wasn't under arrest at that moment. He wasn't in handcuffs. This was a conversation. That made it more dangerous. Because conversations can change outcomes. McDonald didn't threaten him immediately. He didn't even mention prison at first. He talked about the case, Nassau County charges, interstate trafficking, control buys, voice recordings, photographs. He spoke about them like a man reviewing weather patterns. Matter of fact, unemotional. The message was subtle but clear. We have you. Henry listened without interrupting. He had expected exaggeration. Prosecutors often inflate their position, but the way MacDonald presented it suggested something worse. Confidence. Confidence means evidence. MacDonald opened one folder and slid a sheet across the table. Dates, times, locations, controlled purchases documented with precision. Henry's mind moved quickly. Who talked? How many? What did they give up? The prosecutor didn't need to answer those questions out loud. The paper answered them quietly. You're facing significant time, MacDonald said. The phrase significant time landed differently than the numbers his lawyer had mentioned. Coming from a federal prosecutor, it felt less hypothetical. Henry had always viewed prison as a possibility, not a certainty. He believed in maneuvering, in technicalities, in loyalty buffering outcomes. MacDonald wasn't discussing technicalities. He was discussing sentencing guidelines, conspiracy, distribution thresholds, mandatory minimums. The math wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal. Henry remained outwardly calm, but inside something shifted again. The parking lot realization had been about physical survival. This was about temporal survival. Decades. Decades means watching your children grow through letters. Watching seasons change through reinforced glass. MacDonald let the silence linger after laying out the case. Silence is a tool. It forces the other person to fill it. Henry didn't fill it. He waited. Then MacDonald pivoted. There are two paths here. The phrasing was deliberate. Two paths. The first path was trial. Conviction likely. Lengthy sentence. The second path was cooperation. MacDonald didn't use the word betrayal. He didn't need to. He spoke in legal language. Substantial assistance. Information of value. Consideration at sentencing. Henry's jaw tightened slightly. He had always known this moment could come. The federal indictment had made it inevitable. Prosecutors don't build strong cases without exploring the possibility of flipping someone up the chain. The question was whether he would be the one flipped. What are you asking? Henry said quietly. MacDonald leaned forward slightly. We're not interested in just your drug operation. That sentence froze the air. Henry knew what that meant. Lufthansa, hijackings, internal operations, names, structures, patterns. The federal government wasn't just targeting cocaine. It was targeting a network. And Henry sat at the intersection of that network. He didn't respond immediately. Inside, calculations accelerated. If he refused, the case would proceed. The evidence seemed strong. Control buys, interstate elements, recorded conversations. He could gamble on acquittal. But gambling with decades isn't the same as gambling at a card table. If he accepted, he would be crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. There is no halfway cooperation in that world. Once you talk, you don't go back. MacDonald didn't rush him. He didn't demand an answer. He outlined the framework. We can make recommendations. We can seek reduced sentencing. We can offer protection. Protection. That word mattered. Henry had been thinking about physical danger from his own crew for weeks. The parking lot. The subtle distancing. The fear that Jimmy might act preemptively. Witness protection wasn't just about hiding from the mob after testifying. It was about surviving long enough to testify. MacDonald described it calmly. Relocation. New identities. Support during transition. It sounded clinical, almost bureaucratic. But beneath the bureaucracy was something profound. An exit. Henry had spent his entire adult life inside one structure. The Mafia wasn't just crime. It was identity, family, belonging. MacDonald was offering something radical. A reset, at a cost. Henry felt the weight of that cost press against his ribs. He thought about Jimmy, about the shared history, about the risks taken together, about the trust that had once felt unbreakable. He thought about Paul's calm withdrawal, about the financial cutoff, about the silence. He thought about the parking lot. He thought about decades in federal prison. The air in the room felt thinner. MacDonald watched him carefully, not predatory, but attentive. He had likely sat across from men like Henry before, men standing at a crossroads between loyalty and survival. The prosecutor spoke again, quieter now. You need to think about your family. It wasn't manipulation. It was strategy, because family reframes loyalty. Henry's loyalty had always been outward, toward the crew, toward the hierarchy. But his children slept in his house, not Jimmy's. Karen shared his bed, not Paul's. The arithmetic began shifting internally. MacDonald didn't demand an answer that day. He left the offer hanging in the air like a bridge not yet crossed. "We're willing to talk again," he said as he gathered the folders. Henry walked out of that room feeling different than he had when he entered. The federal indictment had been a threat. This was an option. An option changes everything. At home, Karen saw it immediately. They offered something, didn't they? He didn't deny it. He explained in fragments. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. Reduced time. Protection. New start. Karen's eyes flickered with something between fear and relief. For weeks, she had lived with the dread of mob retaliation and federal prison simultaneously. The offer represented escape from both. But escape meant betrayal. She didn't say the word. She didn't have to. Henry sat at the kitchen table long after the conversation ended. The table had become his confessional. Deals planned there. Money counted there. Now decisions weighed there. He replayed MacDonald's tone in his head. Calm. Confident. Certain. He replayed Jimmy's tone too. Measured. Evaluating. Distant. The contrast was stark. One side offering a structured exit. The other offering silence and suspicion. The decision wasn't made in a single dramatic burst. It formed slowly. A crack widening. A line being approached. He imagined refusing. Going to trial. Maintaining loyalty. Possibly serving decades. Possibly being eliminated before that trial even occurred. He imagined accepting. Testifying. Entering witness protection. Living with the label forever. The word rat would follow him like a shadow. But shadows are preferable to graves. The next meeting with MacDonald would not be casual. It would be decisive. Henry understood that now. He wasn't just negotiating legal strategy. He was negotiating identity. And once that negotiation concluded, there would be no going back. The offer lingered in the air like oxygen and poison at the same time. Breathe it in, and you survive. Breathe it in, and you lose everything you once were. Henry stared at the ceiling that night, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house. He had always believed survival meant strength. Now survival meant something else. Choice. And he was running out of time to make it. Chapter 13. The decision to flip. The decision did not come with a dramatic confession. It came with a sentence. I want to live. Henry didn't say it out loud at first. He said it inside his own head, sitting alone in his car outside his house long after midnight. The engine was off. The street was quiet. The windows fogged slightly from his breathing. He had spent years believing he was untouchable as long as he stayed useful. That loyalty, history, shared risk, all of it built a shield around him. But shields only work when both sides hold them. Paul had lowered his. Jimmy was measuring him. The federal government was building a case. And Henry had finally understood something that cut through all the noise. No one was coming to save him. The indictment had made prison real. The meeting in the parking lot had made elimination possible. The conversation with Ed MacDonald had made escape imaginable. And imagination is powerful when survival is threatened. He replayed the offer again in his mind. Reduced sentence. Protection. A new identity. Protection. That word mattered more now than it had in the meeting. Because the danger wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't theoretical mob discipline or vague federal guidelines. It was a tightening vice. He had seen how Jimmy cleaned house after Lufthansa. The men who were too nervous, too flashy, too risky. They didn't get second chances. They disappeared. And Henry now carried something none of those men had. Federal leverage. If Jimmy believed there was even a small chance Henry might cooperate under pressure, Jimmy might not wait for that pressure to break him. That thought lingered like a quiet hum beneath everything. Henry tried to measure loyalty against years, against shared robberies, against nights of planning and execution. But loyalty does not erase exposure. Exposure changes everything. He thought about prison, not in abstract numbers anymore, but in seasons, in birthdays missed, in watching his children grow up through photographs. He imagined the sound of metal doors closing behind him for the final time. That image terrified him more than anything. The Mafia had always promised security in exchange for obedience. But security evaporates when you become a liability. Henry finally admitted to himself what he had resisted. He was a liability, and liabilities get resolved. The next meeting with Ed McDonald felt heavier. There were fewer pleasantries this time, less small talk. Henry sat across from the prosecutor with a different posture. Not defeated, not desperate, but resolved. McDonald didn't press him. He didn't need to. He had seen the shift in Henry's eyes. "You thought about it," he said quietly. Henry nodded once. He didn't make a speech. He didn't justify. He didn't try to negotiate dramatically. He asked practical questions. What would it look like? How soon? What protection would cover Karen and the kids? That was the moment. Not when he said yes. When he asked how. Because asking how means you have already accepted the premise. McDonald outlined the framework. Formal cooperation agreement. Debriefings. Full disclosure. Testimony if required. Full disclosure. Those words carried weight. It meant everything. Not selective cooperation. Not partial truths. Everything. Henry felt a flicker of hesitation then. The final instinct of loyalty clawing upward. If he talked, Jimmy would go down. Paul could be implicated. Others too. Men he had shared history with. Men who had trusted him. But had they still trusted him? Paul had cut him off. Jimmy had grown distant. Distance in that world isn't accidental. It's protective. They had already begun protecting themselves from him. Now he would protect himself from them. The arithmetic was cold but clear. If he stayed loyal, he risked prison and possibly death. If he cooperated, he risked reputation and exile. Death versus exile. Prison versus identity. He chose exile. The words finally came out in that sterile federal office. "I'll cooperate." There was no applause. No dramatic shift in lighting. Just paperwork. McDonald nodded once, as if confirming something he had expected. From that moment forward, Henry's life changed irreversibly. Debriefings began almost immediately. Rooms with tape recorders. Legal pads. Agents who listened more than they spoke. Henry started with narcotics. The Pittsburgh pipeline. Names. Dates. Quantities. Routes. But that was only the surface. They wanted structure. Hierarchy. Hijackings. Lufthansa. Internal conversations. Patterns of behavior. He spoke steadily at first, like recounting business transactions, because that's what they had been to him. Business. But as the sessions continued, the weight grew heavier. Each name spoken felt like cutting a rope that had once tied him to his old world. There was no turning back. The agents listened without emotion, occasionally clarifying, occasionally pressing for specifics. They weren't interested in drama. They were building cases. Henry realized something unsettling during those debriefings. He knew more than he thought. Details he had filed away casually over years suddenly became evidence. Small remarks Jimmy had made. Logistics from Lufthansa. Who was present? Who wasn't? The more he spoke, the more the scale of it dawned on him. He wasn't just reducing his sentence. He was dismantling a network. And networks don't forget betrayal. Witness protection arrangements moved quietly in the background. New names prepared. New locations discussed. Relocation plans forming like blueprints. Karen struggled with it more visibly than he did. Leaving everything behind isn't cinematic. It's brutal. Friends. Neighborhoods. Familiar routines. All gone. New identities aren't clean slates. They're masks. Masks you were forever. Henry tried to reassure her. That was necessary. That survival demanded it. But survival always cost something. The children were too young to understand fully. They would grow up in a world where their father's past was a secret, a past that could never be acknowledged publicly. Henry thought about Jimmy often during that period. Not with hatred, with inevitability. Jimmy would find out. The news would travel through channels. Henry imagined the moment, the realization that he had flipped. Jimmy's reaction wouldn't be loud. It would be contained. But containment in that world is explosive. Henry felt fear. Not immediate fear of a knock on the door, but long-term fear of retaliation. Witness protection reduces risk. It doesn't erase it. He had crossed the ultimate line. Rat. The word carried more weight in his old world than any prison sentence. He would never return. Never sit at those tables again. Never belong. Belonging had defined him. Now he was choosing survival over belonging. The final paperwork was signed quietly. No ceremony. Just signatures. Ink drying on a page that severed his old identity permanently. He walked out of that federal building feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the decision had been made. The uncertainty resolved. Heavier because there was no reversal. That night, sitting again at the kitchen table, he stared at the wood grain under his fingertips. He thought about the first time he had felt welcomed into the crew. The pride. The sense of purpose. He thought about Lufthansa. The adrenaline. The triumph. He thought about the bodies that followed. He thought about the parking lot. About Paul's silence. About Jimmy's measured questions. About the envelope with the federal indictment. All roads had led here. The movie would later compress this moment into urgency and chaos. A man panicking, helicopters overhead, cocaine fuel collapse. The truth was quieter, colder, calculated. Henry didn't flip because he was high. He flipped because he understood the math. Prison versus protection. Loyalty versus life. And when faced with that equation, he chose life. The decision wasn't heroic. It wasn't noble. It was survival. And survival in his world had always meant making the move before someone else did. This time, the move wasn't a robbery. It was betrayal. And betrayal, once chosen, becomes permanent. He lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet of the house he would soon leave forever. The old world was already receding behind him. The new one hadn't fully formed. He was suspended between identities. No longer a loyal associate. Not yet a protected witness. Just a man who had chosen to live. And in choosing to live, had killed the only life he had ever known. Chapter 14. Telling the truth about Lufthansa. The first time he said the word Lufthansa out loud in a federal room, the air changed. Not because the agents gasped. Not because anyone leaned forward dramatically. But because everyone in that room understood that this was the center of gravity. The drug case had been the hook. Lufthansa was the prize. Henry sat at the table, hands resting flat against the surface, staring at a legal pad while an agent adjusted a tape recorder. The red light flicked on with a quiet click. He had already given them narcotics routes, suppliers in Pittsburgh, buyers in Long Island, details about the control buys. That was business. This was history. He inhaled slowly. The Lufthansa robbery wasn't just a crime. It was a legend. $6 million in cash and jewels taken from JFK Airport in December of 1978. One of the largest cash robberies in American history. It had elevated reputations. It had built myths. And it had left bodies in its wake. Henry began at the beginning. Planning meetings. Who was present? Who wasn't? How the information came from inside the airport. How the crew selected men. How the trucks were taken. How the security routines were studied. He spoke calmly, almost clinically. The agents didn't interrupt much. Occasionally they asked for clarification. Dates. Times. Exact locations. Who said what? They weren't chasing drama. They were building indictments. As he spoke, he could feel something separating inside him. The story that had once been told with pride in quiet back rooms was now being told under fluorescent lights to federal prosecutors. There was no adrenaline here. No celebration. Just transcription. He described Jimmy's leadership. How Jimmy maintained control. How he insisted on discipline after the robbery. How he warned everyone not to spend foolishly. Not to draw attention. He described the tension that followed when men did exactly that. New cars. New jewelry. Too much noise. He didn't need to explain what happened next. The agents already knew parts of it. But hearing it from him mattered. Men who were involved began disappearing. One found dead in a van. Another shot. Another simply gone. Jimmy cleaning house. The phrase wasn't Henry's. It was the crew's. But it fit. The robbery had been executed with precision. The aftermath had been executed with paranoia. Henry described conversations in bars. Meetings in quiet corners. The way Jimmy's tone shifted when he suspected someone might talk. He explained how fear began creeping through the circle. Not fear of police. Fear of each other. The agents wrote steadily. The tape recorder hummed. At one point, Henry paused, because saying the names felt heavier than recounting the logistics. Names meant faces. Faces meant shared history. He spoke them anyway. This wasn't partial cooperation. This was full disclosure. He explained how the money was divided, who received what, how the cash was laundered through various channels, how some of it disappeared quietly into personal spending, how some of it funded further operations. The agents pressed gently. Did Paul know? Did Paul approve? Henry was careful. He told the truth as he understood it. Paul wasn't hands-on in Lufthansa the way Jimmy was. But Paul knew enough. He explained the hierarchy, the Genovese family structure, where Jimmy fit, where Henry fit, where the crew sat in relation to the larger organization. Each explanation peeled back layers that had remained hidden for years. He could feel the weight of what he was doing, not in guilt, in finality. Once this testimony became formal, once indictments followed, once trials began, there would be no return. He imagined Jimmy hearing about it. Imagined the stillness in Jimmy's face, the contained rage, the understanding that Henry had crossed the ultimate line. Rat. The word would travel fast. But the agents weren't interested in the emotional cost. They were interested in corroboration. They cross-referenced his statements with existing evidence. Phone logs, financial records, witness accounts. The pieces began fitting. Lufthansa had always been difficult to prosecute fully because silence had protected it. Silence was now broken. Henry described the mood after the robbery in detail. The initial euphoria, the sense of invincibility, then the tightening paranoia, the suspicion that someone might slip, Jimmy's belief that preemptive action was safer than waiting. Henry realized something as he spoke. He wasn't just recounting events. He was explaining motive, explaining why men died, explaining the logic that governed their world. In that world, risk is removed. And once you become risk, sentiment doesn't save you. The agents understood that logic too. They weren't shocked. They had seen similar patterns in other crews. But hearing it from an insider solidified it. Henry described specific meetings after the robbery where Jimmy discussed discipline, the warnings, the quiet threats, the implication that anyone who talked would regret it. He described his own position then. Trusted, valued, included. And now here he was, dismantling that trust piece by piece. At one point, an agent asked directly, "Why now?" Henry didn't hesitate. "Because I want to live." The room went silent for a second. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. That was the truth beneath everything. Not revenge. Not morality. Survival. The debriefings stretched over days. Lufthansa was too complex to cover in a single session. He revisited timelines repeatedly, clarified sequences, confirmed who was present at specific points. The federal case began expanding rapidly. Subpoenas, grand jury proceedings, preparations for indictments. Henry could sense the machinery turning. He had set it in motion. At home, the atmosphere thickened. Witness protection logistics intensified. Plans to relocate became real. New identities finalized. Departure dates approaching. Karen struggled with the idea that everything familiar would vanish. But Lufthansa testimony made it clear. There was no halfway point. Jimmy and others would be indicted. Trials would follow. Retaliation would be expected. Witness protection wasn't optional. It was necessary. Henry thought about the robbery often during that period. Not with nostalgia. With clarity. Lufthansa had been the high point. The moment where everything seemed possible. But it had also planted the seeds of paranoia. Paranoia that led to killings. Killings that led to fear. Fear that led to isolation. Isolation that led to this room. He understood the irony. The robbery that had elevated them had also destroyed them. Without Lufthansa, maybe the scrutiny wouldn't have intensified. Without the killings after, maybe the internal tension wouldn't have grown so sharp. Without that tension, maybe he wouldn't have feared Jimmy enough to cooperate. The agents pressed him on specifics about who ordered which hit. He was careful to distinguish what he knew firsthand from what he inferred. They appreciated that. Credibility matters in cooperation. Exaggeration undermines cases. Henry stuck to what he had seen and heard directly. That made his testimony stronger. He described the aftermath vividly. The tension in bars. The empty seats where men once sat. The way conversations became shorter. The way laughter felt forced. Lufthansa had made them rich. It had also made them suspicious of one another. That suspicion had never fully dissipated. When the debriefings concluded, the agents thanked him in the same calm tone they had used throughout. No congratulations. No dramatics. Just acknowledgement. Outside the federal building, Henry felt the weight of the sky pressing down. He had done it. He had told them about Lufthansa. There was no going back. He imagined the first indictment being unsealed. Imagine the headlines. Imagine Jimmy reading his name connected to testimony. He felt fear, but he also felt something else. Finality. The decision to flip had been internal. This was execution. He had crossed from potential cooperator to active witness. The machinery would move now without him controlling it. Trials would come. Courtrooms. Testimony under oath. Cross-examinations. Defense attorneys trying to tear him apart. But that was later. For now, he sat in his car and stared at his hands. The same hands that had helped plan Lufthansa. The same hands that had counted the cash. Now they had helped dismantle it. The myth would survive in movies. The helicopters. The chaos. The fast cuts. But the truth had been slower. Colder. More calculated. Henry hadn't flipped in a moment of cocaine-fueled panic. He had flipped after understanding that the crew he served would not protect him. After realizing that the robbery that made them famous had also made them fragile. After calculating that prison and potential elimination were not acceptable outcomes. He had chosen survival. And in doing so, he had ended the silence that had protected Lufthansa for years. The legend would remain. But the truth now belonged to federal transcripts. And Henry Hill was no longer just part of the story. He was the man who told it. Chapter 15. Witness protection and the end of the life. The morning they left, it didn't feel dramatic. There were no flashing lights. No last-second chases. No men waiting at the curb with guns drawn. There were just suitcases. Plain, ordinary suitcases that held whatever fragments of a life could be carried without raising suspicion. Henry stood in the living room of the house that had once felt like a fortress and now felt like a memory already fading. The walls were the same. The floors unchanged. The air still carried the faint scent of coffee and furniture polish. But the meaning had shifted. This house had been a hub, a distribution node, a planning room, a family home layered over a criminal operation. It had held money from Lufthansa, cocaine from Pittsburgh, conversations about hijackings. Now it was being abandoned. Witness protection doesn't begin with new identities. It begins with erasure. A federal marshal met them quietly. No uniforms. No announcement. Just instructions delivered in low tones. No phone calls. No goodbyes. No lingering. Karen moved through the rooms with a look that was hard to define. It wasn't just fear. It wasn't relief either. It was something closer to grief. Grief for a life that had once felt powerful. Grief for the illusion of belonging. The children sensed the seriousness but didn't understand the scope. They were told they were moving. That was all. Moving is normal. Reinvention is not. Henry stepped outside last. He glanced once at the street. The trimmed lawns. The neighbors' houses. The illusion of suburban safety. He knew that by the time the indictments became public, by the time testimony began, this address would no longer belong to him. He slid into the car without ceremony. Witness protection doesn't look like escape. It looks like logistics. They were taken first to a temporary location. A holding pattern while new documents were finalized. New names. New social security numbers. New backstories rehearsed like scripts. The old names were no longer to be spoken casually. Even thinking them too loudly felt dangerous. Henry had spent his entire adult life answering to one identity. That identity carried weight. Reputation. History. Now was radioactive. In the sterile office where the paperwork was finalized, he stared at the new name printed on the documents. It didn't feel real. It felt like wearing someone else's jacket. Witness protection is often portrayed as dramatic relocation. In reality, it is bureaucratic transformation. Forms signed, instructions memorized, behavioral adjustments outlined. No contact with old associates. No revisiting former neighborhoods. No slips. One mistake could unravel everything. Henry listened carefully. He understood the stakes. Jimmy and others would learn soon enough that he had cooperated. The trials would make that undeniable. Retaliation wasn't hypothetical. It was expected. The relocation placed them in a state far from New York. A quiet suburb that didn't know their history. Didn't care about Lufthansa. Didn't understand the Genovese hierarchy. To the neighbors, they were just another family starting over. That anonymity was both shield and prison. For the first time in his life, Henry had no network, no crew, no unspoken rules governing his status. He had to operate like everyone else. Normal. Normal felt foreign. He found himself missing the structure he had once resented. The coded conversations, the hierarchy, the sense of belonging. Belonging had been powerful. Now he belonged nowhere. Karen struggled visibly in the early weeks. She missed familiarity, the comfort of known faces, even if those faces were dangerous. Here, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Henry tried to frame it as safety. Safety over excitement. But safety without identity feels hollow. The trials began months later. Courtrooms filled with reporters and spectators eager for details about Lufthansa. Henry testified. Calm. Direct. Under oath. He described planning meetings. Roles. The aftermath. Defense attorneys attacked his credibility. Called him a criminal. A liar. A rat. They weren't wrong about the first two. But he didn't waver. The decision had been made long before he stepped into that courtroom. Each answer felt like another door closing behind him. Jimmy Burke sat in the courtroom during portions of the proceedings. Henry avoided prolonged eye contact. Not out of fear in that moment, but out of acknowledgement. The line had been crossed. There was no reconciliation possible. Jimmy was eventually convicted in part because of Henry's testimony. Others faced consequences too. The machine that had once protected him was dismantled in pieces. Henry returned to his new home after each day of testimony, feeling emptied. He had spoken against men he once trusted. He had chosen survival over loyalty. And now survival felt quieter than he expected. Witness protection doesn't come with wealth. It comes with modest stipends and expectations of normalcy. Henry struggled with normalcy. Working a regular job felt surreal. Taking orders from managers who had no idea who he once was felt humiliating at times. He had once moved millions in cash. Now he worried about paychecks. There is a specific ego death in that transition. From feared associate to anonymous employee. From insider to exile. He tried to adjust. Sometimes successfully. Sometimes not. The old instincts remained. Suspicion. Quick calculation. Scanning rooms for threats that rarely existed. But the adrenaline was gone. The structure was gone. The belonging was gone. He had survived. But survival felt different than victory. Karen adapted gradually. The children grew up under their new names. They built lives that weren't shaped by the Mafia. That was the point. That was the bargain. Henry occasionally reflected on the movie portrayal of his arrest. The helicopters. The frantic energy. The sudden collapse into cooperation. It was dramatic. It made for compelling cinema. But the truth had been slower. More deliberate. He hadn't flipped because of cocaine paranoia. He had flipped because the structure that once protected him had withdrawn. Because Jimmy's reputation for cleaning house wasn't myth. Because Paul Vario had cut him off. Because the federal indictment carried decades. Because Ed McDonald had offered a path out. Because the math had changed. He had calculated. And he had chosen. In the quiet of his new suburban life. Sometimes he would sit alone and replay the arc of it all. Lufthansa. The killings. The drugs. The surveillance. The arrest. The search warrant. The indictment. The offer. The decision. Each moment felt inevitable in retrospect, like dominoes falling in slow motion. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't glorify it. He understood it. Survival in that world required decisiveness. And when the world turned against him, he had been decisive. But the cost was permanent. He would never return to that life. Never reclaim that identity. He had chosen to live. And in doing so, he had ended the life he once believed defined him. The myth would endure in films and headlines. The helicopters would spin on screen. The panic would look explosive. But the truth was quieter. Henry Hill wasn't brought down by a single chaotic day. He was brought down by accumulation, by paranoia, by structure, by exposure, by isolation, and ultimately by choice. In the end, the drug bust wasn't the climax. It was the catalyst. The real story wasn't the arrest. It was what came after. The abandonment, the calculation, the offer, the betrayal, the relocation, the slow erasure of a man who once believed he was untouchable. Witness protection didn't give him a heroic ending. It gave him a quiet one, a life stripped of myth, a life defined not by legend, but by survival. And survival, in his world, had always been the only rule that truly mattered.